Chapter 528. There was seawater in all directions. It was as heavy as a giant rock pressing down on him. The ink-like seawater poured into his mouth, nose, and ears, making it impossible for him to breathe. His body swayed endlessly with the undercurrent. He looked like a fish that had been knocked unconscious. At any moment, he could be swept up by the undercurrent and smashed into the submerged reef. Suddenly, Fan Xian opened his eyes. His pupils were calm. His cheeks gradually puffed up. Using the pressure of the qi in his body and the pressure of the seawater outside, he barely managed to achieve a balance. His right hand stretched out and created a line in the seawater. Suddenly, he grabbed the corner of a reef at the bottom of the sea and stabilized his body at the bottom of the sea. He was a full 40 feet from the surface of the water. Earlier, the sword from outer space had not pierced his body, but the sword intent had already attacked his heart meridian and caused him internal injuries. This internal injury was even more terrifying than Yan Xiaoyi's arrow earlier. The tyrannical Jinqi in Fan Xian's body moved quickly, resisting the power of nature. Tianyi Dao's Jinqi moved gently along the circulation in his body, slowly smoothing out the injuries caused by Yi Liuyun's heaven-shaking strike. Deep at the bottom of the sea, there was no way to immediately heal it. However, it could at least suppress the injury for a while. However, the two different types of Jinqi in his body were moving at high speed, bringing a great burden to his body. A wave of power was expanding inside his body. Gradually, two streams of blood flowed out from his nostrils. Disturbed by the undercurrent of the sea, the blood quickly dispersed into a cloud of blood mist, covering his face. The arrow wound on his shoulder also began to bleed rapidly. His entire body was like a leather bag filled with red paint. Someone had pricked two small holes. It looked very terrifying. Fan Xian's cheeks puffed up, and his eyes were wide open. His face had already changed shape. With one hand clawing at the submerged reef, he looked at the surface of the sea like a toad. The problem was, this toad was bleeding and would die at any moment. Thus, he could not laugh, nor was he in the mood to laugh. Thinking of the dangerous scene earlier, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The seawater scattered his hair, making it float around like seaweed. Amidst the seaweed, a complicated emotion flashed through the pupils on his deathly pale face. On the surface of the sea, Yan Xiaoyi's arrow was still waiting for him. He could not immediately float to the surface of the sea. As for the great grandmaster breaking through the waves on a boat, presumably, he would have no interest in attacking him again after his attack had failed. He didn't know how long he had been in the sea. The skin of his hand, which was gripping the submerged reef, already had a strange feeling. But, he stared wide at the surface of the sea. He had no way to escape. At this moment, he finally felt a trace of regret. Yesterday, he should have brought that box with him. If he had that box by his side, he wouldn't have been suppressed by Yan Xiaoyi's arrows. Speaking of which, this only proved that the person Fan Xian was most wary of after his rebirth was still the Qing Emperor. Perhaps this was a shadow left over from history, or perhaps it was just a subconscious part of his intuition. However, he did not want to reveal his trump card in front of the Emperor. He could. As he was, as he with the Emperor as. And as he, and, to, he. He didn't know the Emperor's trump card. He didn't know how the Emperor would react once he knew he had a weapon that could kill gods and monarchs in this world. This kind of thinking affected Fan Xian's decision, which was why he had sunk into his current dangerous situation. Fortunately, he had not died to those arrows and swords. He should be proud of this. If the story of the dance at the bottom of the cliff, the black arrow, and the sword breaking through the waves spread throughout the world, presumably, everyone's understanding of Fan Xian would enter a whole new level. A great grandmaster and the world's most powerful 9th-level ace had not been able to kill Fan Xian. It was enough to make him proud. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body valiantly provided the nutrients his body needed. Without being able to breathe air, he would not be able to hold out for long. Fan Xian's nose and mouth were no longer bleeding. The wound on his shoulder had been soaked in the seawater until it had turned white. Like the stomach of a dead fish, it was no longer bleeding. A glimmer of determination flashed across his pale face. His right hand moved down again and picked up a large rock from the sand at the bottom of the sea. He didn't dare to float up for now, so he chose a stupid method he had learned from watching Hui Yuanjia in his previous life. However, back then, Hui Yuanjia had walked on the bottom of the river. Right now, he was walking on the bottom of the sea. Hugging the large rock, he used its weight to stabilize his body. Under the impact of the undercurrent at the bottom of the sea, he did not sway. Fan Xian stepped forcefully on the sand and advanced. He did not try to break out of the encirclement by following the shoreline. There were aces blocking the two sides of Dong Mountain. He couldn't guarantee that his remaining Jinqi could support him on the bottom of the sea for long, so he chose the closest path to the surface of the sea. He walked to the bottom of the Jiaozhou Navy's ship. Raising his head, he opened his eyes and calmly glanced at the bottom of the ship, which was darker than the color of the seawater. A powerful desire to escape made his 6 senses incomparably sharp. He could even clearly see the moss and shells at the bottom of the wooden ship. He put down the heavy rock in his arms. The rock landed on the bottom of the sea and didn't make much noise. It only shook up some sand. His hands slowly drew 2 semicircles and carried out one last adjustment. Fan Xian relaxed his body and followed the buoyancy of the sea to float upward as naturally as possible. He was terrified of startling Governor Yan, whose eyes were like an eagle's, ears like a shark's, and nose like a dog's. Maintaining the feeling of a piece of driftwood, Fan Xian slowly floated to the bottom of the military ship. Very carefully, he moved toward the outer edge of the bottom of the ship. He still didn't poke his head out of the water. Separated by about half a foot of seawater, he did his best to watch the movement on this side of the ship. This was a gamble. The reason he had chosen this ship was because Yan Xiaoyi had not fired the arrow from this ship earlier. If the helper he was looking for was not on this ship, Fan Xian could only dive down again and search for an opportunity on another ship. He didn't know if he would be able to make it to the other ship. Fortunately, his luck this time was not bad. A strange smile rose to Fan Xian's pale face soaking in the seawater. He thought to himself that his luck in this life was indeed incomparable to that of others. He saw a hand on the side of the ship. The hand was very naturally resting on the side of the ship. It was gently making noiseless knocks, maintaining a steady and strange frequency. On the surface of the sea, there were 5 Navy ships slowly cruising. Under the illumination of the moonlight, these ships were like demons searching for prey, slicing through the surface of the water, ready at any moment to nail the prey hidden at the bottom of the sea. Another 3 ships sailed far away from the main group, maintaining a corresponding distance. They were responsible for providing support and keeping a wider watch. On one of the ships, the lights in the middle of the hall were dim. The Jiaozhou Navy general in charge of this ship, Su Maokai, was sitting coldly in an armchair. Of his 3 trusted soldiers, 2 were responsible for guarding outside the hull. 1 was responsible for communicating with the Navy's flagship. There was only 1 trusted soldier left by his side. The soldier's face was hidden in the darkness behind the light. His facial features could not be seen clearly, but it could faintly be seen that his face was slightly pale. No one knew if he had been frightened by the battle array tonight. It was completely silent on the ship. Suddenly, the trusted soldier opened his mouth to speak. Why did the Jiaozhou Navy also betray? Su Maokai was now the third-ranked figure in the Jiaozhou Navy. He had enough power under his command. For a major matter like tonight, if he didn't know the inside story, he would not have followed the Navy's flagship to surround the sea around Dong Mountain. He lowered his head and then slowly said, "Young master, the situation right now is not that the Jiaozhou Navy has betrayed. Rather, it is you who has betrayed." The trusted soldier was Fan Xian, whose luck was so good that he had quietly snuck onto the ship. Su Maokai was an old member of the Quanzhou Navy. Furthermore, the hand that had been hanging outside the ship proved that he had been secretly hoping that Fan Xian would be able to escape from death. Thus, Fan Xian had enough trust in him. After hearing these words, Fan Xian still furrowed his brows. Fan Xian and the emperor had long guessed what the eldest princess would do. For such a major matter as the Dong Mountain attack, they could at most control the news for a few days. In the end, the emperor would be assassinated and the crown prince would succeed. The matter of the emperor being assassinated needed someone to take the blame. That person had to have enough power to kill the emperor and have the motive to do so. Only then would they be able to convince the Empress Dowager in the palace and the officials in court. Even if it wasn't to convince, they had to give those people a psychological explanation. It was clear that among the group of people heading to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, the only person who had the power to kill the emperor was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, who held 500 Black Knights and had a few unknown aces in secret. As for the motive to assassinate the emperor, presumably, given the eldest princess' intelligence, she would circle around the matter of the old Yi family that the Empress Dowager was most wary of. You didn't respond. I trust that you also didn't send a message to Wu Gufei. You also didn't send a message to Ho Jichang. Fan Xian stood behind Su Maokai and stared coldly at the side of his face. In order to prevent someone from suddenly entering the room, he had only slightly bandaged his wound at the back of the ship and disguised himself as Su Maocai's trusted soldier, standing behind him the entire time. I had you stay with the Jiaozhou Navy for this day. Fan Xian's tone was calm, but there was a glimmer of anger in it. In the end, you didn't do anything. The Overwatch Council assassinating the emperor may have convinced some of the generals in the navy, but how could you believe it? Furthermore, why was Yan Xiaoyi on the navy ship? Did these navy generals not have questions in their hearts? Why would they believe in your loyalty and have you come to Dong Mountain? Su Maokai lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, as for the matter of assassinating the emperor, there should be some people who would believe it. After all, the Overwatch Council's reputation is not good. Furthermore, we received news yesterday that 500 Black Knights had traveled overnight from the Jiangbei camp to Shao Mountain. There was suddenly no news of them in the East Shandong Road area. Thus, it makes sense to say that these 500 Black Knights had come to assassinate the emperor. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He had moved the 500 Black Knights here. However, they hadn't gotten close to the area of Dong Mountain. If the Jingdo people came here again and the emperor was truly unable to escape disaster, it would be difficult for him to explain. Fortunately, he still had a few trump cards. Su Maokai once again described the current military situation in detail. The more Fan Xian listened, the more helpless he felt. He had been at the top of the mountain for a day and half a night. Apparently, the rumors at the foot of the mountain had become completely different. Had he colluded with Dongyi's Sigurd to assassinate the emperor? Damn it! This kind of method of investigating the evidence is too childish. However, Fan Xian knew that methods were always secondary. As long as victory and defeat were decided by strength, no matter how childish the eldest princess's investigation was, it would become an ironclad fact in the history books. Of course, most people in the Navy have doubts. I even believe that some people know the truth of the Dong Mountain matter, Su Maokai said coldly. Even if they know the truth, so what? If it was still Chang Kun leading the army in the past, given his and the old Navy general's respect for the emperor, they would certainly not participate in this matter even if they were beaten to death. Young master, you went on a killing spree in Jiaozhou last year. Many of the old generals have already been killed. Who knows how many generals have begun to feel cold toward the court. Presently, the Jiaozhou navy is already the world of the Qin family. Even if it was truly a rebellion, I believe the generals on the navy ships at the foot of Dong Mountain would be very willing. Fan Xian calmly said, you should also know the truth. I have never doubted the changes in the navy. The emperor also knows about the Qin family. I believe he will certainly have follow-up plans. Thus, I am still curious as to how you obtained the eldest princess's trust. He suddenly furrowed his brows and said, their hearts are cold toward the court. Presumably, you have contributed to this matter. Mao Kai, I had you stay in the Jiaozhou navy, not to have you create a rebel army. Su Mao Kai was silent for a moment. He then suddenly rose and bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. Sincerely, he said, young master, I am not talented. I have never been able to completely control the Jiaozhou navy in my hands. Since the eldest princess has rebelled and the Qin family has also joined in, you should have seen it. There is still that great grandmaster on the sea. This is a rare opportunity. His eyes stared at Fan Xian's pale face. A glimmer of loyalty and passion flashed through them. Gritting his teeth, he said, young master, take the opportunity to rebel. Fan Xian stared into Su Maocai's eyes and didn't speak for a long time. He knew this general's loyalty toward him, no, toward his mother. It wasn't that he hadn't guessed why he would bring up such a rebellious suggestion. He only gently shook his head. Why? Su Maocai lowered his voice and said anxiously, presently, all the truly powerful people in the world have been attracted to the great Dong Mountain. Jingdo is just an empty stomach. Young master, take the opportunity to go ashore and contact the 500 Black Knights in the Shao Mountain area. Travel 1,000 li to attack Jingdo and coordinate with Director Qin from the inside and outside. In one move, you can control the royal palace. Once both sides have suffered heavy losses at Dong Mountain, you can, as a prince, climb high in Jingdo and raise your arms. Everything will be done. Fan Xian did his best to calm his tone to avoid hurting the heart of the person in front of him. Warmly, he said, the emperor is very guarded against me and has never let me command the army. How could a mere 500 Black Knights enter Jingdo? There are 10,000 Jingdo garrison outside Jingdo, 13 city gate guards in Jingdo, and 3,000 imperial soldiers. How could I deal with them? The commander of the Jingdo garrison is the great prince's trusted aide. The imperial army is completely under the great prince's control. The 13 city gate guards are directly under the emperor's command. Once the emperor is not present, they are headless people. It was clear that Su Maocai was prepared. Methodically, he spoke one thing at a time. Young master, since you have taken the risk to break through, you must have a keepsake from the emperor on you. It should be a personally written letter or jade seal. You can enter the palace alone, convince the Empress Dowager, and obtain Iguipin's support. Outside the palace, ask Director Qin to take action and sweep away the Crown Prince and Second Prince's power in one move. Fan Xian waved his hand and cut him off. All of this is built on the premise that the Great Prince supports me. Su Maocai didn't wait for him to finish and admonished, if the emperor dies, you also have the jade seal and imperial letters in your hands. You are also close friends with the Great Prince. If the Great Prince doesn't support you, who will he support? What about the Qin family? Fan Xian stared into his eyes and said each word clearly. And what about the Yi family in Dingzhou? How many soldiers do the two sides have combined? The Yi family has run the Jingdo garrison for 20 years. The Great Prince is unable to completely control them. So what? Su Maokai lowered his voice. There are 7 roads of elite soldiers in the Qin Kingdom. Yan Xiaoyi is in Dong Mountain and cannot move the northern expedition camp. The Yi and Qin families only have 2 subordinates. There are still 4 roads of elite soldiers. As long as you can control the palace, these 4 roads of elite soldiers will all be in your hands. Even if Jingdo is in danger at the beginning, in less than half a month, the entire situation can be reversed. The reason you hesitate is because you have never carefully analyzed just how much power you can mobilize in your hands. Su Maokai stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said each word clearly. The emperor was attacked by assassins in Dong Mountain. You have the Jade Seal and the emperor's personally written letter as proof. The crime of assassinating the emperor can easily be placed on the heads of the eldest princess, crown prince, and second prince. This is a righteous reason. In less than half a month, this righteous reason will receive the approval of the 4 roads of elite soldiers. Although you have no one in court, Prime Minister Lin has probably left a number of people for you. As for the beginning of the major event, the situation in Jingdo will be turbulent. However, Director Qin is the best at this kind of thing. Also, don't forget Minister Fan. He will certainly support you. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He admitted that for the sake of the rebellion, Su Maokai had secretly put in a lot of effort and schemed for him for a long time. If the situation continued to develop like this, if he could leave the sea, escape Yan Xiaoyi's pursuit, and return to Jingdo, perhaps the power of the Qin kingdom would truly be incomparably close to his hands. Was this kind of temptation great? Fan Xian didn't know because his state of mind was clear. He had not thought in that direction at all. Chapter 529. The sea wind whistled past the ship. The waves pushed the ship up and down. Although the lampstand attached to the wall of the ship would not fall to the ground, the flames in the lantern were sometimes large and sometimes small. The light made the expressions of the 2 people in the cabin uncertain. There was the faint sound of a message outside. A soldier knocked on the door and entered to report something to Su Maokai. He then hurriedly left the cabin. Tonight, the people within a radius of 20 li around Dong Mountain had sunk into a tense and fearful atmosphere. Regardless of whether they knew the truth or not, they were all terrified and uneasy. We need to expand the search area, Su Maokai said in a low voice. His expression was complicated. Fan Xian's words earlier had directly overturned all of his thoughts. If the emperor had not died. Su Maokai did not believe Fan Xian's deduction. Although he didn't know the eldest princess's entire plan, looking at the situation at hand, how could the emperor have survived from the summit of Dong Mountain? As he was thinking, Fan Xian stood to the side and watched him quietly. It was clear that Su Maokai had played an important role in the Jiaozhou Navy's rebellion. Otherwise, the eldest princess's side would not have been at ease in allowing him to bring a ship here. Fan Xian knew that Su Maokai had never had any loyalty to the Qin court. He only had hatred and a desire for revenge. This so-called rebellion was something that happened naturally. However, the person he wanted to help in his rebellion was Fan Xian himself. That was why Su Maokai had not followed Fan Xian's plan and immediately made contact with the Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gufei or Ho Jichang. He had not sent the news of the Jiaozhou Navy's strange movements to the Overwatch Council, thus creating the difficult situation of Dong Mountain being surrounded. This was a chess piece Fan Xian had buried deeply in the Jiaozhou Navy. Because the chess piece had its own thoughts, it had lost its original use. Fan Xian could not get angry. Even his anger was faint because he knew this person's heart. Su Maokai saw that he was unable to convince Fan Xian. The expression on his face dimmed. A moment later, he said, "My original plan was to at the last moment, move my subordinates to launch a counterattack on the sea, disrupt the Navy's encirclement, forcefully go ashore, and receive you down the mountain before heading to Jingdo. Fan Xian's heart trembled. Given the few ships in Su Maocai's hands and the strength of over 1,000 soldiers, he wanted to go ashore to receive him down the mountain. Presumably, he had the determination and courage to die. Who would have thought that you would actually be able to? Su Maocai shook his head and sighed. A glimmer of respect rose uncontrollably in his eyes. In the eyes of these people, a person who could escape from the precipice of Dong Mountain, which was as smooth as jade, seemed to have already left the realm of mortals. Su Maocai continued, "Your guess is correct. This time, the Jiaozhou Navy has joined the eldest princess plan. One reason is because of the Qin family, but the more important reason is because of my participation. If I let you meet with danger on the mountain, then I would not be able to make up for it even if I died 10,000 times. Fortunately, because of this, Governor Yan trusts me very much. Presumably, he won't be able to find this ship. You can rest assured and stay here." Fan Xian coughed and shook his head. "I have to get back to Jingdo." After boarding the ship, the first thing he did was ask Su Maocai about the situation of the blockade on land and sea. He knew that the blockade tonight had gathered countless powerful people. In addition, there were terrifying 9th-level assassins from Dongyi. If he wanted to break through the blockade on land, it would be very difficult. "Can you have the ship go 3 li north?" He furrowed his brows. "Beyond 3 li, those people won't be able to control a wider area. We should be able to find an opportunity. There are too many eyes watching. I have to wait." Su Maocai glanced at him worriedly and sighed. In his opinion, returning to the capital was not the most important thing right now. Finding a way to contact the Black Knights and then get in touch with the people in Jingdo to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight was the wisest choice. How could Fan Xian not know that if he wanted to obtain the greatest benefit, it would be the best move if he could escape back to Jiangnan, notify Xueqing, and then return to the capital from Wuzhou to wait for backup. However, this kind of decision was, without question, not something a normal person could make. There were too many people in Jingdo that he needed to care about. The survival of the Qin kingdom and whether or not war would break out. As Fan Xian's position, he had to keep these things in mind. "I can't wait too long," Fan Xian said straightforwardly in a low voice. Fan Xian lowered his voice and spoke straightforwardly. The flame in the lamp rose and fell with the waves outside the cabin. It added a glimmer of worry to his face that was rarely seen. He could leave behind the Great Dong Mountain because Uncle Wu Zhu, whom he was most worried about, was in the absolute environment of the Great Dong Mountain. Compared to Yi Luyun, Siga Jian, and even old eunuch Hong, he had an absolute advantage. No one could keep him. However, Jingdo urgently needed him to return. They needed the jade seal in his pocket and the emperor's personally written letter to the Empress Dowager. "Outside Danzhou, were you on the ship?" Fan Xian asked in a low voice as he stood behind Su Maocai, still wearing his bodyguard uniform. "Yes." Receiving a definite answer, Fan Xian immediately asked, "When did Yan Xiaoyi get on the ship?" "I'm not sure," Su Maocai replied. "It should have been on the way from Danzhou to Dong Mountain." Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It looked like the eldest princess's alliance had received mutual approval. There weren't many cracks within that could be used. "In Danzhou, you should have seen a white sailboat." Su Maocai tilted his head in confusion and said, "That was your ship." "Of course, I noticed it. I want to get on that ship." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. His tone carried a sense of unquestionable certainty. "Yan Xiaoyi's eyes have probably already risen from the bottom of the sea. It will be too difficult for me to go ashore. Is there a way to head north on the sea?" Su Maokai furrowed his brows and said, then it would be better to take the ship directly to Danzhou. However, that will depend on luck. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then nodded. My luck has always been excellent. On the dark surface of the sea, the Navy ship closest to Dong Mountain shone with a bright light. It did its best to maintain contact with the ships around it. The ship was enormous. Compared to the great Dong Mountain that stretched between heaven and earth, it was pitifully small. It was like a green bean in front of a piece of white paper. The soldiers on the ship stared nervously at the surface of the sea. It was as if they wanted to find clues in the water. Occasionally, someone would shout something. Many soldiers held bows and arrows in their hands, ready to shoot into the sea at any moment. A long time had passed since the figure on the stone wall disappeared into the waves. From the surface of the sea to the land on either side of Dong Mountain, countless people were searching for Fan Xian's traces. No one thought that Fan Xian would be hiding on the rebel soldier's own ship. Yan Xiaoyi, dressed in light archery gear, stood silently at the head of the ship. The soldiers at his side helped him carry the heavy golden bow. He picked up a cup of strong wine from the wooden table beside him and drained it in one gulp. He continued to stare coldly at the waves below the cliff. Although a long time had passed, he still believed that Fan Xian had not died. Although Fan Xian had been hit by his arrow and intimidated by the sword that broke the waves, Yan Xiaoyi still believed that Fan Xian had not died. He sent out an order for the navy and the soldiers on the shore to step up their search. Yan Xiaoyi knew that Fan Xian was injured, but he unconsciously hoped that Fan Xian was still alive. It would be best if he was still alive in front of him and then have his arrow ruthlessly pierce into his throat. He loathed Fan Xian, this pretty boy. He hated him because he knew that his only son's death had something to do with Fan Xian. It was also because that night in the streets of Jingdou, he had held a hard bow in his hand. Yet, he had been at a complete disadvantage in his foggy confrontation with Fan Xian. This was a humiliation he could not accept. Fan Xian had to die by his hand to wash away this humiliation. This time, you probably won't be so lucky. A ruthless light flashed through Yan Xiaoyi's eyes. He stared motionlessly at the stone wall of Dong Mountain. He thought of the scene he had seen earlier, the scene that had shocked him. That pretty boy had been able to slip down from such a high, steep, and smooth precipice. If it were not for Yan Xiaoyi's profound realm and startling eyesight, the Navy soldiers on the surface of the sea would not have found a trace of Fan Xian. Fan Xian would probably have used the water to escape thousands of li away. All of the rebel soldiers would have thought that the young commissioner was still trapped on the mountain. This was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of strength. Yan Xiaoyi's heart chilled slightly. He was shocked by the strength Fan Xian had demonstrated. Because the ship was too far from the precipice, his 13 consecutive arrows had not nailed Fan Xian to the precipice. They had only injured him. This reality made it difficult for Yan Xiaoyi to suppress his emotions. How could such a powerful enemy allow him to escape tonight's sure-kill situation? How is the search on each ship? Yan Xiaoyi asked with a cold face. When he did not find a trace of Fan Xian in the ocean, he immediately thought that the kid had climbed onto their ship from the ocean. The people the Jiaozhou Navy had sent this time were all people on their side who knew the inside story. Yan Xiaoyi did not suspect anything. The admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy, Qin Yi, glanced at him and said in a low voice, "He's not on the ship." He was a second-generation figure of the Qin family and the cousin of the Deputy Bureau of Military Affairs, Qin Heng. Because of Fan Xian's investigation of the Jiaozhou case last year, he had the opportunity to take over the position of admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy. Since he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Yan Xiaoyi at the bow of the ship, the Qin family's attitude was clear. Be careful. This person is very crafty. Since he came down from the mountain, he must have something important on him. If he is allowed to rush back to Jingdo, it will probably have a great impact on the eldest princess and old Qin master's plans, Yan Xiaoyi said quietly. Qin Yi acknowledged. Although he was a first-level admiral of the navy, in front of Yan Xiaoyi, this super-level admiral, he didn't have the slightest qualification to be unyielding. Particularly in this siege of Dong Mountain, all sides looked out for each other, but the one with the most power was still Yan Xiaoyi. Yan Xiaoyi looked at the ocean in front of him and suddenly furrowed his brows. I'm worried that Fan Xian has come ashore from the bottom of the ocean. No one can hold their breath at the bottom of the ocean for so long. Qin Yi shook his head. Qin Yi shook his head and said, there are your trusted soldiers on the shore, as well as the aces from Dongyi. They shouldn't give him a chance. A strange smile rose to the corners of Yan Xiaoyi's lips. He thought that for that pretty boy to be able to slide down a precipice hundreds of meters high, how could he be judged by common sense? Seeing Yan Xiaoyi's worry, Qin Yi calmly said, tomorrow, at the latest, the day after tomorrow, the plans in the provinces along the road will begin. Although we cannot use the name of the Overwatch Council, we have to send out the news that Fan Xian assassinated the emperor. He is the most serious criminal in the world. How can he escape? Yan Xiaoyi glanced at him mockingly and didn't say anything. He thought, how could a normal general know the power of a 9th-level ace? If he was allowed to come ashore and enter the vast sea of people, even if the court was fooled by the eldest princess and gave Fan Xian the charge of rebellion, who could guarantee that Fan Xian would not be able to enter the capital? If Fan Xian escapes ashore, he will certainly find the closest Overwatch Council subordinate to send a message to Jingdo, Yan Xiaoyi said coldly. Although there are Overwatch Council spies everywhere in the provinces, he is most at ease. The ones closest to him are, without question, the people he left in Danzhou. Qin Yi understood and said, I will immediately arrange for someone to go to Danzhou. If Fan Xian was on this ship and heard this conversation, he would certainly want to hug and kiss Yan Xiaoyi. He had been on Su Maocai's ship thinking hard about how to return to his own ship in Danzhou. Unexpectedly, Governor Yan had given him such a wonderful opportunity. However, why did he have to go to Danzhou? Yan Xiaoyi finished arranging everything and slowly raised his head. The index and middle fingers of his right hand unconsciously curled up. This was a habitual movement brought about by his long years as a bow and arrow. Following the movement of his fingers, his gaze had already landed on the distant and dark summit of Dong Mountain. He knew where the emperor was and what awaited the emperor. Even though the rebellion had already progressed to this stage, as a soldier, he still felt 1 part admiration, 3 parts reverence, and 5 parts discomfort toward the emperor. If his only son's death had not made it clear to him that his son was never as precious as the emperor's son, perhaps Yan Xiaoyi would have chosen some other method and not done what he did tonight. Fortunately, he did not need to interfere in the matters on the summit. Yan Xiaoyi thought this. Handing over the soldiers in front of the mountain gate to that person was part of the agreement. His mood would also be a bit better. Then, he bowed respectfully toward the surface of the sea, wishing that the old man on the boat, who was about to ascend Dong Mountain, would send the emperor off on his behalf. Chapter 530. Yesterday, I wrote that Yan Xiaoyi was 1 part admiration, 3 parts respect, and 5 parts uneasiness toward the emperor. A reader asked on cue, 1 plus 3 plus 5 is equal to 9. Old cat, what about the last part? At this moment, I looked around and called out to Big Mountain, what about the last part? What about the last part? Big Mountain's reply said to me, that is respect for the author's muddle-headedness. P.S. Everyone, give me some monthly votes. The milk-like white mist slowly spread across the surface of the sea. It was quiet all around. There was only the faint sound of water rippling not far away. The sound grew clearer and clearer. 3 battleships broke through the mist like ghosts and gradually revealed their black hulls. Su Maokai stood at the head of the ship and gave orders in a low voice to his subordinate officers. This group of 3 ships obeyed the order and followed the coastline north in pursuit. It didn't take long for them to reach their designated location. This place was about 12 li away from Danzhou. The Overwatch Council's ship with white sails was anchored on the docks south of Danzhou. With the cover of the thick mist, these 3 battleships could approach the Overwatch Council ship without anyone noticing. However, this also brought unknown trouble to their search. The Navy soldiers already knew that the black-clothed man who had escaped from Dong Mountain in the night was the target of this trip, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. They didn't know why their superiors had sent them to the south of Danzhou. They didn't know that Yan Xiaoyi was certain that after Fan Xian escaped, he would make contact with his trusted aide on this white sailboat at the first instant. Fan Xian wore a slightly loose personal soldier's clothing that covered his black night clothes and equipment. He hid in the front cabin of the battleship and was not worried about being discovered by the people on the ship. His eyes peered out through the crack in the window lattice and narrowed slightly. He was worried about the ship on the other side of the mist. The 3 ships headed north on the sea, maintaining an excellent distance from the coastline. Su Maokai tried a few times to get the ship closer to the shore but was worried that his movements would be too big and raise the suspicions of the pursuers. Thus, Fan Xian was unable to go ashore during these 2 hours. Fan Xian had thought about escaping alone, but he was worried about the subordinates he had left in the south of Danzhou. The Qinian unit still had a small group left on the ship. Hong Chongqing, whom he liked very much, was still responsible for the affairs on that ship. At this moment, there were 3 naval battleships surrounding and attacking him. If he escaped, what would happen to the lives of his subordinates? He didn't know if Yan Xiaoyi was on one of the 3 ships. Anger and helplessness welled up in his heart. He had always thought that his luck was extremely good, but now he realized that luck was a double-edged sword. If he didn't show himself, the Overwatch Council ship would certainly become the Navy's primary target. No one on the ship would survive. If these 3 warships were all controlled by Su Maokai, Fan Xian would have a better way to deal with them. The problem was that Admiral Qin Yi did not make such a mistake. The 3 warships were transferred from the 3 generals. More importantly, Fan Xian didn't think Yan Xiaoyi would be so careless. If he thought he was going to find the Overwatch Council subordinates in the south of Danzhou after escaping, why wouldn't he follow him? He sat on a chair by the window and adjusted his breathing. He knew he was about to face a difficult choice. Yan Xiaoyi had moved troops to attack the south of Danzhou. This was using the lives of his subordinates to force him to show himself. Yan Xiaoyi had probably long guessed that he was hiding on a ship. However, he didn't know which ship he was on and couldn't search without giving the Jiaozhou Navy face. The problem was, Fan Xian also didn't know which ship Yan Xiaoyi was on. If only he knew. The white fog grew thicker, but the sea wind grew stronger. Gradually, it blew away the fog, which was as thick as a mountain cloud, to the sides. Through the window, one could faintly see the cliffs and green trees by the shore. Quietly anchored by the shore, the white sailboat as beautiful and lovely as a virgin, the sailboat that had accompanied Fan Xian for a long time, gradually entered everyone's sight. Fan Xian's heart tightened. The cliff and green trees on the shore were too tempting for him. If he abandoned that ship and directly went ashore, even if Yan Xiaoyi was on the ship right now and went ashore to pursue him, he was confident he had a 60% chance of escaping, mixing into the sea of people and reaching Jingdou. However, that ship was even more tempting for Fan Xian. The lives and deaths of his subordinates on that ship were also very important to Fan Xian. When all was said and done, he had lived 2 lives and still hadn't reached Chen Pingping's realm. He had to board that ship. He had to warn his subordinates still deep in their dreams before the Navy rebel army launched their attack. The sound of ropes snapping gradually rang out on the 3 Navy battleships. Fan Xian's heart tightened again. He knew that the catapults on the ships were being prepared. It was clear that the people on the white sailboat in the distance had relaxed their guard because they were deep in the heart of the Qing kingdom and had no major figures to protect. They did not sense the strange movement on the sea. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. With a flick of his finger, he called Su Maokai back into the cabin. In a low voice, he prepared to gamble. The 3 battleships moved in a triangular formation and slowly surrounded the Overwatch Council's ship. When they were still some distance away, the ship Su Maokai was on suddenly seemed to be struck by a wave. There was a problem with the helmsman's control, and the angle of the bow of the ship was slightly off. The rebel army generals on the other 2 ships furrowed their brows slightly. They thought General Su had not been in battle for a long time and had made such a mistake. Seeing that he hadn't alerted the target on the shore, they didn't take it to heart. It was this momentary negligence. With a muffled thud, it seemed to be the sound of some heavy machinery being pulled. Immediately after, a shrill whistling sound broke through the air in the white fog. Several sharp stones flew out from the catapult on the battleship that Su Maokai was on. The enormous weight carried a terrifying speed as it flew across the sky above the water surface. It ignored the gentle mist enveloping it and smashed down without any warning toward the battleship of the Navy that was closest to the shore. A few loud bangs rang out. One of the rocks smashed into the side wall of the battleship and smashed right above the waterline, creating a large, black hole. A piece of stone smashed into the main mast of the battleship. With a crack, the thick main mast broke in the middle, revealing sharp and towering wooden stubble. The large sail fell down with a crash, smashing down who knew how many Navy officers. The nooses that were connected to the sail also became soul-sucking ropes in that instant. Driven by the mast, they swept across the ship, tearing through the air and passing those Navy officers who were standing stupidly, cutting their waists in half. It could only be said that this rock had good luck. In just an instant, it caused a heavy death on the battleship. Countless amounts of blood, flesh, and red water sprayed out. These were 3 battleships prepared for a sneak attack. When they were ambushed from the inside by their own people, everything seemed very sudden. They had no time to defend. It was as if in this instant, the 3 battleships in the triangular formation all stopped at the same time. Time stopped. One could only hear the terrifying sound of huge rocks breaking through the air. Fire! Su Maotsai's face was ashen as he shouted in a low voice. Following his order, countless fire arrows rose into the air at the same time and shot toward the already heavily damaged battleship. The fire arrows landed like raindrops on the already heavily damaged battleship. It was unknown whether the officers on the ship were dead or alive. No one organized a counterattack, much less a rescue. In just an instant, the entire ship began to burn. In particular, the sails covering the ship became the largest source of fuel for the fire. Su Maotsai's expression was complicated. Everyone on that battleship was his colleagues. If it was not the most dangerous moment, he would not have chosen to use such a method to ambush. To be able to organize the attack of the entire ship in such a short amount of time, if he had not operated in the Jiaozhou Navy for 20 years and if the soldiers on this ship were not all his trusted aides, he would not have dared to imagine such a good result. He furrowed his brows and gazed at the white sailboat on the shore. From the strange movements on the boat, he realized that the Overwatch Council should have already reacted. He had done what he promised the young master. He clenched his right fist slightly and gestured behind him. On the right side of the battleship that had suddenly launched a despicable sneak attack, the crossbow machine used for close combat on the sea suddenly moved. With a muffled sound, the entire battleship shook slightly. The crossbow bolt with an anchor quickly shot out and landed directly on the Overwatch Council battleship on the shore. The two ships were connected by the rope pulled by the huge crossbow arrow. The people of the Chenian unit of the Overwatch Council courageously sprinted to the side of the ship with the intention of cutting the rope. However, they heard the sound of an arrow of command coming from the sea fog. They couldn't help being startled. They then turned and ran, abandoning the ship with incredible speed. Following the gangway to the shore, they climbed ashore. Like countless shadows, they disappeared into the fog on the shore. Their movements were so fast that it left one dumbfounded. This was the reason the Overwatch Council was so powerful. The reaction of all of the officials and secret agents of the 8 bureaus to the sound of an arrow of command was already rooted in the depths of their hearts. They didn't need to ask why, they only needed to do as they were told. On the sea, a ship burned fiercely. Occasionally, wretched cries rang out. The ship that had launched the sneak attack stopped on the sea and was connected to the white sailboat on the shore. After the people on the white sailboat fled at a shocking speed, they left behind a dead ship. As for the last ship, speed up. A glimmer of fear flashed through Su Maotsai's eyes. Looking at the undamaged Navy battleship, it suddenly sped up. With extraordinary speed, it charged forward from the bottom left and directly entered the area of the sea in front of the Pin family. It lay between his ship and the shoreline. Furthermore, he could clearly see that the other ship was already preparing to launch an attack. Earlier, Su Maokai had already thrown out all the stones and fire arrows on the ship in exchange for such a result. Seeing that the other party was preparing to launch an attack, his first reaction was, "Return to the helm." Return. Before he could say the words, "Return to the oars," Su Maotsai's mouth opened, but he couldn't say a single word. A gust of wind forced its way into his lips, making it difficult for him to make a sound. The wind of an arrow. A foot viciously kicked Su Maotsai's hip bone. The powerful force sent him flying. He crashed into the side of the ship and sent up a few splinters of wood. It was because of this that he was lucky enough to avoid the wind of an arrow coming toward him. When Su Maotsai's body had just been kicked to the side, the wind of the arrow brushed past his face and flew out. The wind of the arrow was as powerful as a pine tree piercing through a mountain. However, it did not make a loud sound and was completely sinister. There was a light whoosh. Su Maokai lay in the splinters of wood and looked at the scene in front of him in a daze. He was so terrified that his body began to tremble. There were a total of 5 Navy soldiers with delicate little holes on their bodies. They still maintained the expression of their last moments of life and death. They stood with their eyes and mouths agape. However, they were no longer breathing. Blood flowed out from their throats, chests, abdomens, and the delicate little holes on their heads. A delicate little black arrow was nailed into the wooden planks of the front of the battleship. The feathers of the arrow trembled at high speed and made a buzzing sound. Blood dyed the feathers of the arrow. With a drip, a drop of blood fell. A drop of blood. A floor full of dead people. What kind of arrow was this? Pulling back the foot that had kicked Su Maotsai's body, Fan Xian knew he had lost the gamble. Yan Xiaoyi was indeed on the ship, but he was not on the fire ship that Su Maokai was desperately attacking. He knew that his tracks had already fallen into Yan Xiaoyi's eyes. It was useless to continue to hide. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the battleship that still maintained a fast speed and crashed toward the official ship on the shore. He looked at the bow of the ship at the head of the ship, wearing black light armor and holding a bow like a god. With a flip of his hand, he put on the light-colored side of the Overwatch Council's official robes. He turned his head and glanced at Su Maokai, whose face was half in a pool of blood and who had already lost an ear. His right foot, wearing a calf leather boot, had already stepped onto the rope connecting his ship to the white sailboat. His body swayed. The disguised Fan Xian slid along the rope in the fog. His body was slightly arched, and like a leopard, he silently slipped into the white mist. With a swish, an arrow did not shoot toward Fan Xian's body, which had disappeared into the fog. Instead, it shot toward the crossbow rope tied to the right side of the battleship. In an instant, the tip of the arrow tore the rope knot into pieces. The rope between the two ships drooped weakly into the sea. However, there was no sound of anyone falling into the water. Yan Xiaoyi coldly pulled back his longbow and watched as the ship under his feet crashed toward the Overwatch Council official ship at an extraordinary speed. On the other end of the fog, Fan Xian was like a ghost. Holding the broken rope with one hand, he floated into his familiar cabin. He didn't have time to see if any of his subordinates were injured. He also didn't care that less than an arrow's throw behind him, the massive Navy battleship was heading toward his butt. He directly kicked one of the boxes in the cabin. With a loud and clear sound, the sturdy and hard wooden box was kicked by his foot, which contained an endless amount of zhenqi. Wood chips flew everywhere, and silver light shot out in all directions. Silver light shot out in all directions. 130,000 taels of silver poured out of the cracked chest like a ripe pomegranate whose belly had been cut open. Chapter 531. Fan Xian stretched out his arm and caught the black chest in the silver ingots scattered all over the floor. A slightly rough but textured feeling came from his fingers. This kind of familiar and wonderful feeling seemed to, in an instant, pour boundless courage and zhenqi into his body. It made him throw away all of his timidity and fear. He was filled with confidence and did not think much of the ship that was about to crash into him behind him. He threw himself into the cabin. This series of actions was too fast, so he didn't notice there was someone beside him. Thus, when his ambition was multiplied and he carried the black chest, prepared to break out of the cabin, enter the land, and dominate the world, he abruptly discovered that there was an extra person wearing the robes of the Overwatch Council beside him. He couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. He was only stunned for a moment because this person was Hong Changqing, a trusted aide of the Qinian unit he had given the important task of. There was no time to talk. Fan Xian only glanced at him. The meaning of this glance was clear. I've sent out an arrow of command. Why aren't you running? Hong Changqing stared back at him in a daze. The meaning in his eyes was also clear. How could he bear to throw away 130,000 liang of silver and run? He had to watch for you a bit longer, right? Was the so-called mutual appreciation of talent a meeting of eyes like this? Their gazes met for a moment before separating. Hong Changqing moved with incredible speed to stand behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian's left hand, which was as hard to escape as an azure dragon, also viciously grabbed the back of Hong Changqing's neck. Bang! An arrow accurately shot into Hong Changqing's abdomen. Countless flowers of blood bloomed. Hong Changqing's face suddenly paled. Although his previous step had been to bravely block the arrow for Fan Xian, he had never thought that this arrow would so easily break through the wind of his knife and strike his body. The power of the arrow did not stop. It viciously pierced into the silver ingots scattered on the deck of the ship. Coincidentally, it pierced into the silver ingots. It looked like a metal skewer piercing a steamed bun. It was very cute and terrifying. Fan Xian's face was heavy. With one hand holding the chest and the other grabbing the back of Hong Changqing's neck, he sprinted toward the back of the ship. Behind him, the arrows fell like rain, following his footsteps and chasing after his soul. However, they did not make his steps chaotic or slow down. Let's find the Black Knights and meet up again. Fan Xian placed one foot on the railing at the end of the boat and slapped his palm against Hong Changqing's chest, who was powerless to speak. He sent in a thread of Tianyi Dao's gentle zhenqi and temporarily helped him seal his blood vessels. His body was like a large bird. Borrowing the power of this slap, he leaped into the air. Lightly and powerlessly, he flew quickly. In the next moment, he had already landed on the shore. He didn't even turn around to look at Hong Chongqing, who had miserably fallen into the sea. Although he didn't know what degree of injury that arrow had inflicted on Qinghua, he firmly believed that Qinghua wouldn't die. Since he could survive that hellish island, he would definitely survive this time as well. Perhaps this was a kind of psychological self-comfort, or perhaps it was a kind of blessing. Perhaps Fan Xian truly believed in Qinghua's ability to play dead. On the sea, Su Maokai held the side of his face that was bleeding and said sinisterly, "Reverse the oars." The Navy battleship under him began to nimbly turn its rudder, distancing itself from the fighting on the shoreline. The surface of the sea was covered in thick smoke. Mixing with the white fog, it made people's vision even worse. Su Maokai knew that he had to take advantage of this opportunity to leave this troublesome place. According to the young master's plan, he had to start drifting on the sea and, if necessary, rush back to Jiaozhou. The ship quickly retreated in the sea. Su Maokai stared at the white sailboat by the shoreline. His pupils constricted slightly. At this moment, he could no longer help Fan Xian. He was very worried about whether or not Fan Xian could escape alive. A massive crash rang out. The only undamaged ship of the 3 Navy battleships was like a killer whale charging onto the shore to catch a sea lion. Viciously and unstoppably, it crashed into the Overwatch Council's white sailboat. Affected by the powerful force of the collision, the seawater by the shoreline seemed to boil and raise waves half a person tall. With the shoreline as the center, they spread out in all directions. With a series of cracking sounds, the Overwatch Council ship seemed to be about to fall apart from this collision. In the instant of the collision, 6 or 7 figures used the force of the collision to rise from the Navy battleship into the air. They maintained a perfect formation in the air. With a few swishing sounds, they landed on the tail of the violently shaking Overwatch Council ship. The most breathtaking one was the one among the 6 or 7 people, Yan Xiaoyi, who was dressed in thin black armor. He was like a god as he soared through the air and landed steadily on the deck at the stern of the ship like a boulder. After landing, he did not move at all. Beside him were 5 aces of the North Expedition Camp's personal guards. Yan Xiaoyi arrived quickly, but Fan Xian and the Qinian unit subordinates ran even faster. Other than the silver ingots and wood shavings all over the ground, there was no one else on the ship. Yan Xiaoyi stood at the tail of the ship and stared coldly at the shore. He stared at the quickly disappearing black dot. Pulling back his wrist, his right arm shook. At some point, the soul-eating longbow with golden threads had appeared in his hand. Loading the arrow and controlling the bowstring, the series of actions flowed in one breath like flowing water. The distance between the tail of the ship and Fan Xian's body on the shore was not too far nor too close. It was the distance at which the longbow could unleash its greatest destructive power. The black arrow left the bowstring with power like wind and thunder. This arrow had already condensed the peak of Yan Xiaoyi's spirit and power. It seemed to have faintly broken through the so-called limits of speed and passed through the membrane of space. It was invincible. One moment it was on the bowstring, the next moment it was already behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not have time to turn his head, nor could he turn his head. Even though he had become the fastest dodging person in the world under Wu Zhu's training, after experiencing a night of fighting and running, faced with Yan Xiaoyi's fastest and most powerful arrow since last night, he still had no way of dodging it. As expected, the tip of the arrow pierced viciously into Fan Xian's back. No, it should have hit the black chest on Fan Xian's back. A muffled grunt came from the fog on the shore. The black dot seemed to stagger and almost fell to the ground from the arrow. For some reason, it immediately pushed off the ground and ran quickly into the distance. Not dead. Not dead. Covered by the thick fog, the people on the ship could only faintly see Fan Xian's figure. Even someone as powerful as Yan Xiaoyi did not clearly see the details of the arrow hitting the other person. A glimmer of fear and confusion appeared on the faces of Yan Xiaoyi's 5 trusted soldiers. After a night of chasing Fan Xian to this point, everyone's confidence gradually faded. There was actually someone in this world who could slip down a smooth precipice hundreds of feet high. There was actually someone in this world who could be hit by the governor's arrow with all his strength and only stagger. These trusted soldiers suddenly thought of the background of the person they were chasing. They thought of the legendary Tianmai being and many stories related to Fan Xian. It was inevitable that some emotions would surge in Yan Xiaoyi's heart. However, his cold face made it impossible to see the changes in his heart. He slapped the railing of the ship and floated to the shore. The faint sound of horses galloping came from the forest by the shore. The 5 trusted soldiers at the stern of the ship met each other's eyes and swept ashore with unswerving determination. In a moment, a group of riders galloped out of the forest and gave up their mounts to Yan Xiaoyi's group of 6. Yan Xiaoyi's preparations could not be said to be inadequate. This trip to Danzhou to lure and kill was carried out by land and water. With fine horses below, how could Fan Xian escape? The sound of horse hooves rang out. The group chasing Fan Xian disappeared into the fog on the shore. After the white-sailed official ship was hit, it began to slowly sink into the icy ocean. Bodies and debris floated everywhere on the surface of the ocean. Hong Chongqing jumped down. Fan Xian jumped down. Yan Xiaoyi and his trusted soldiers also jumped down. The 130,000 liang of silver also sank. The chase continued. A day later, in the primitive and dense forest to the north of Danzhou, behind a large tree, Fan Xian, dressed all in black, was sitting on the moss. He panted heavily and occasionally stretched out his hand to wipe away the blood seeping out of the corner of his mouth. Then, he gently stroked the small dot on the surface of the chest in his arms. A chill rose in his heart. From his youth, he had known the sturdiness of this chest. Even the black dagger Sir Fei had given him could not leave a mark on it. Who would have thought that Yan Xiaoyi's arrow had left a mark on the chest? From this, it could be seen how powerful Yan Xiaoyi's arrow was. Presumably, those people had not expected him to directly block that arrow. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. With such a chest on him, if he didn't use it as a bulletproof vest, then he would be stupid. However, he knew that although the chest had blocked the tip of the arrow from piercing into his body, it had no way of blocking the sharp intent of the arrow and the powerful vibrations that were transmitted to him. Thus, his internal organs were injured on top of injuries, and his Xinqi was beginning to show signs of disorder. That was why he was trapped in the dense forest to the north of Danzhou by Yan Xiaoyi's pursuit group in an area with a radius of less than 10 li. However, Fan Xian was not worried. On the contrary, a faint excitement began to rise in the depths of his heart. He forcefully suppressed his slightly panting breathing. With a gentle pull of the fingers on both hands, he opened the long and narrow black chest. Inside the chest were simple, unadorned, and even simple-looking metal objects. Fan Xian knew that this was far from being as tyrannical and beautiful as the golden silk longbow in Yan Xiaoyi's hand. It was the most terrifying weapon in this world. He closed his eyes and rested for a moment. Then, his hands began to quickly move about in the chest. Following a series of simple and beautiful clicking sounds, a weapon that did not belong to this world calmly appeared in his hands. The last time this weapon appeared in this world, it directly led to the strange deaths of 2 Qing princes, created King Cheng's ascension to the throne, and gave the present emperor the opportunity to sit on the throne. From a certain point of view, the destruction of the Wei kingdom, the change in the situation of the world, and the power of the Qing kingdom all stemmed from the assault rifle in Fan Xian's hands. M82A1, a simple code name, a black chest, a legendary divine weapon. After dealing with all of this, Fan Xian closed the chest and hugged the gun to his chest. He rested for a while, but he was unable to truly enter a meditative state. Behind him in the forest, Yan Xiaoyi was like a mad tiger, closely following him. Secondly, the feeling of metal coming from his chest made his mind somewhat distracted. He felt as if he was not in the Qin kingdom or this world. It was as if he was in the old world that he had not seen for many years. In the forest of Yunnan, he was fighting to the death with those vicious and evil mercenaries. This kind of absurd feeling twisted his entire state of mind. However, a powerful exhaustion and the excitement and anticipation for what would happen later made him not throw down the gun. Escaping from the seaside to here, Fan Xian had not had a chance to counterattack. Perhaps it was the weakness of caution in his bones acting up. He continued to carry the chest into the dense forest. When he passed by Danzhou, he was afraid he would bring unknown harm to the people and grandmother in the city. Naturally, he could not go forward to ask for help. He drew an arc from a distance and led Yan Xiaoyi and his group into the forest behind the cliff. The scene of assembling the gun earlier had already proved that Fan Xian had not neglected this aspect of training these years. He remembered that when he was newly married in Tsongshan, he had held this assault rifle every night on the snowy mountain and practiced. Thus, his chest was filled with confidence. If Yan Xiaoyi was said to be a warrior who had used the power of a cold weapon from a long distance to the extreme, then Fan Xian was a beginner who had trained hard for a long time and was trying to kill from a long distance for the first time. This was a showdown between the peak of cold weapons and gunpowder civilization. This kind of comparison, from the beginning, was unfair. Bang! An arrow ruthlessly nailed into the large tree Fan Xian was leaning against. However, Fan Xian didn't even open his eyes. He also didn't make any defensive movements. He knew that the people Yan Xiaoyi brought were also skilled archers. Hearing the sound of the arrow, he knew that Yan Xiaoyi was halfway up the mountain on the other side, staring fixedly at the activity on this side. The two places were separated by a great distance. This kind of small test would not make him stupid enough to reveal himself. After adjusting for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian opened his eyes. He knew the condition of his body. In such a complicated and dangerous mountain forest battle, it was difficult for him to recover his yuanqi without sufficient rest. He couldn't waste too much time here. He tied the black chest back onto his body and used his dagger to cut off some vines and leaves to use as camouflage. He then carefully checked the 5 small mechanisms he had left in front and behind the tree. His right hand held the heavy sniper rifle. Using the large tree as cover, he carefully climbed up the mountain. Thinking of the people who had died this night, Fan Xian licked his dry lips as he crawled. Chapter 532. If he had not been forced into a dead end, Fan Xian would never have thought of using the black chest. At the beginning, when he had followed the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, he had always thought the emperor was playing with him, so he had left the chest on the boat. The chest had been on the boat the entire time, wrapped in the 130,000 liang of silver and exposed in the main hall of Suzhou Hua Garden, welcoming the gazes of the people coming and going. The emperor and Chen Pingping had almost lost sleep thinking about this chest. No one had thought that Fan Xian would be so carefree as to choose such a place to store it. The most dangerous place was the safest place. This was true for people, and it was also true for the chest. He wanted to go up the mountain because he knew that in this unequal fight, his biggest advantage was that Yan Xiaoyi didn't know what kind of weapon he had. Yan Xiaoyi didn't have the slightest understanding of the terrifying firearms. At a distance of 500 meters, Yan Xiaoyi could only be hit by him. Once Yan Xiaoyi broke into 300 meters, given the speed and power of Yan Xiaoyi's archery, Fan Xian would probably be shot until he couldn't even raise his head, let alone aim. Thus, he had to pull away from Yan Xiaoyi and wait for Yan Xiaoyi to appear in his field of vision. The reason Fan Xian did not immediately look for an opportunity to counterattack after taking the chest on the boat was because he knew that Yan Xiaoyi did not need to aim and could fire 13 arrows in a second. He needed to aim for a long time before he could just barely fire one shot. If he randomly shot on the shore, presumably, he would become the most useless transmigrator to die in history. The assault rifle was not so fun. This was something Uncle Wu Zhu had not forgotten to remind him when he taught him how to use a gun. The wind speed, the temperature, the refraction of light, the so-called error of a millimeter, the difference of 1,000 li, referred to these things. Fan Xian did not want to randomly aim and fire a shot, only to shoot through a tree 50 meters away from Yan Xiaoyi. If he let a powerful warrior like Yan Xiaoyi experience the threat of a bullet and know that he had such a terrifying long-range weapon, he would certainly have a way to close in on him and greatly reduce the power of the assault rifle. Thus, Fan Xian only allowed himself to fire one shot. Fan Xian had his reasons for being so careful and thinking so highly of Yan Xiaoyi. Ever since he was young, he had learned under Fei Jie's tutelage. Before he was 16, he had grasped the Overwatch Council's tracking, concealing, and assassination methods. Killing Xiao An on the shore of the North Sea was already proof of his strength. After entering deep into the woods to the north of Danzhou, Fan Xian set down traps along the way and eliminated his traces. Using the help of the dense woods and the steep, leafy ground, he attempted to shake off Yan Xiaoyi's pursuit. However, he was unable to succeed. Yan Xiaoyi and his group always maintained a distance of about 300 meters from him. Only in the end did Fan Xian understand that Yan Xiaoyi had once been a hunter in the mountains. It seemed that he was born with a sensitive sense of smell for his prey. Since he was his prey, it would be difficult for him to shake off his pursuit. As for those traps, they were probably nothing in Yan Xiaoyi's eyes. Just as Fan Xian was quietly admiring Yan Xiaoyi on the high mountain, a few muffled groans and wretched cries came from the big tree below where he had temporarily rested earlier. Yan Xiaoyi looked coldly at the soldier who had been pierced to death by the wooden nails. There was no sorrow in his eyes. On the contrary, a wildfire began to burn brightly. Ever since they had abandoned their horses to the north of Danzhou and entered the mountains, 3 of his 5 trusted soldiers had died to Fan Xian's tricks and traps. The person who had died in front of him was the 4th. Having chased to this point, Yan Xiaoyi, who was a superior 9th level ace and close to the realm of a great grandmaster, had the same thoughts as Fan Xian. He felt some admiration for him. Yan Xiaoyi knew what kind of damage his arrow, particularly Sir Yi Liuyun's sword, had done to Fan Xian on the precipice. If Fan Xian's ability had fluctuated between the upper and lower 9th level before, then, after being heavily injured and having experienced a night of running, Fan Xian could at most be considered an 8th level ace. He had thought that personally taking action to kill a heavily injured Fan Xian would be an easy matter. However, such a heavily injured person was still able to lay down so many traps in the mountains. Some of the traps and mechanisms were things that even Yan Xiaoyi himself had not been able to completely discover. Thus, he had killed his subordinates and prevented him from moving forward. A rotting smell wafted through the mountain woods. No one had entered the primeval forest to the north of Danzhou for thousands of li swamps and rocky mountains bordered each other. Ferocious beasts fought vines. Near the sea, the moist wind blew, blowing out the world's densest flora. The denser the flora, the more dangers were hidden inside. No one knew whether this rotting smell came from animal corpses or from the accumulation of old fallen leaves and the heat of the scorching sun. In any case, it smelled bad and piercing to the nose. Yan Xiaoyi sniffed and slowly circulated the jinqi in his body. With great difficulty, he sniffed out the scent that was well hidden by the rotting smell. The traps and mechanisms all had this smell. The deaths of Yan Xiaoyi's 4 trusted soldiers originated from this. If he had not carefully investigated, he probably would not have smelled it. Yan Xiaoyi did not forget that Fan Xian was Sir Fei Jie's student, one of the most vicious users of poisons in the world. Who knew where else in the mountain woods Fan Xian had laid down poisons? Yan Xiaoyi gazed at the mountain and narrowed his eyes. He didn't understand where Fan Xian's body had gotten so much energy and courage to support him for so long. Thinking of this, the glimmer of a confident smile appeared at the corners of his lips. The more powerful the enemy, the happier it was to kill. Governor. The only surviving soldier swallowed and said in a trembling voice, "Once you enter the dense forest, it will be difficult to walk out alive." He lowered his voice and said, "After all, Fan Xian doesn't know about the secret passages in the mountains like you do." Yan Xiaoyi glanced coldly at the soldier and didn't say anything. The mountains to the north of Danzhou and the primeval forest in the mountains were the key to cutting off the land transportation between Qin Kingdom and Dongyi. If it weren't for that secret passage, it would have been impossible for the siege of Dong Mountain to succeed. Since half a year ago, Yan Xiaoyi had placed all of his attention on the matter of transporting soldiers through the secret passage. He had a special understanding of the terror of the secret passage and the surrounding mountain woods. It was precisely because of this that he felt a glimmer of respect for Fan Xian for being able to hold out until now. "There are 5,000 brothers at the foot of Dong Mountain waiting for you to return. Are you at ease letting an outsider lead?" This soldier was clearly stunned by the deaths of his 4 brothers and Fan Xian's poison that would kill him instantly upon contact with blood. He didn't notice Yan Xiaoyi's gaze. He lowered his head and said, "Even if Fan Xian can get out alive, Jingdo has the eldest princess holding down the fort. Why bother?" Yan Xiaoyi was silent for a moment. He then waved his hand as if to indicate for the soldier to stop talking. His hand just so happened to land on the soldier's face. With a crisp crack, the soldier's head was like a flattened watermelon, twisted and deformed. His facial features were all squashed together by the palm. He didn't even make a muffled grunt as he fell stiffly to the ground. Yan Xiaoyi glanced coldly at the body on the ground and walked to the back of the large tree. Crouching down, he pressed down on the wild grass that had been flattened by Fan Xian. He confirmed that Fan Xian hadn't left for too long and confirmed the direction Fan Xian had left in. He then silently chased after him. Looking at the figure that flickered in and out of the optical sight, Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath. It affected the injury on his back that had been caused by the arrow. He coughed in a low voice. He wasn't in the mood to admire the wonders of the black chest for being able to preserve this heavy sniper rifle so well and for the optical sight to remain so clear. He only cared about admiring Yan Xiaoyi's mobility and powerful sixth sense. He had been hiding in the underbrush for a while and had been staring at the area up the mountain. A few times, he had almost locked onto Yan Xiaoyi's body. However, Yan Xiaoyi seemed to have an innate sense of danger. Every time he stopped for half a second, he would move again. Using the cover of the towering tree and the dense foliage, he approached the peak step by step. Fan Xian sucked in a deep breath. He was worried that his earlier coughing would give Yan Xiaoyi a direction. Forcefully suppressing the sharp pain in his back, he wormed his way out of the underbrush and climbed upwards. He found a large tree that required at least 5 people to surround. Leaning against the tree trunk, he panted heavily. Air quickly poured into his throat. The burning temperature and his body's greed for oxygen made each of his breaths incomparably fast. His throat felt waves of dryness and pain, and an unbearable tearing sensation began to rise from his chest. Fan Xian loosened the tie at his collar and forcefully closed his mouth. He breathed through his nose and cursed a few times in his heart. He wondered why he still lacked confidence even though he had a heavy sniper rifle. The recoil wasn't that strong, so why didn't he dare to test it out in advance? Before he could finish cursing in his heart, he felt a trace of strangeness, and his entire body immediately tensed up. Then, he heard a light thud. The giant tree behind him seemed to tremble slightly. It should have been an arrow. Fan Xian didn't have much of a reaction at first, but he immediately remembered that his trusted soldiers had all died. This arrow had been fired by Yan Xiaoyi. His pupils constricted abruptly. He immediately bent his legs slightly and relaxed his knees. His body leaned forward slightly. This was the only change in posture he had the ability to do in this instant. This posture could dissipate the force. Following the powerful force behind him, he allowed his entire body to fall forward and do his best to dissolve it. If he forcefully blocked it at this moment, his end would certainly be wretched. With a muffled hum, Fan Xian fell forward from the shock and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. His entire body fell into the thick grass and shrubs. There were countless thin cuts on his face and hands. The bark of the giant tree behind him, about the size of a palm, had completely split open, revealing the white tree trunk inside. A delicate little arrow, like a venomous snake that had been lying in wait for a long time, stretched out the black tip of the arrow. With the tip of the arrow as the center, the white tree trunk was shattered inch by the powerful zhenqi of the arrow. Fan Xian didn't have time to look at the strange scene on the tree behind him. He also didn't have time to rejoice that he hadn't put down the box on his back. He didn't even have time to wipe away the blood at the corner of his lips. He had already begun another escape. Relying on his tyrannical zhenqi to support his tired body, he ran wildly toward the top of the mountain. Yan Xiaoyi had disappeared from the scope for less than 5 seconds, and he was already within 100 feet of him. This kind of movement and terrifying movement made Fan Xian's heart go cold. A moment later, Yan Xiaoyi, dressed in light armor like a god, appeared behind this large tree. However, his body was covered in mud and he looked wretched. Yan Xiaoyi coldly observed for a moment and then chased after him again. However, as his feet moved, he once again unconsciously lay down in the grass. He could feel a heart-chilling danger that had almost locked onto him earlier. Yan Xiaoyi had once felt this kind of aura in the fog-filled streets of Jingdou. What confused him was that to be able to lock onto him from so far away, unless Fan Xian had already reached the realm of a great grandmaster or was like him and had the help of a godly bow. But, he still carefully lay down in the grass. Half kneeling on the ground, Fan Xian found that the target continued to hide in a blind spot. He couldn't help but curse silently. Putting away the heavy sniper rifle, he swallowed the fishy blood that surged into his mouth and charged toward the top of the mountain. The north of Danzhou was filled with tall mountains. Probably no one knew that at the peak of the mountain where Yan Xiaoyi and Fan Xian were shooting at each other was a flat piece of mountainous terrain. The summit of the mountain was as flat as a grassland. Strangely, there wasn't a single large tree. There was only long grass that was knee-deep and spread out like a green carpet. The strange meadow at the top of the mountain stretched all the way to the edge of the precipice. In the grass beside the precipice, Fan Xian set up the frame and placed the black chest calmly by his side. The expression on his face had already calmed down. He knew he had no way out. Even if he carried the chest and climbed down the precipice, it was daytime. If Yan Xiaoyi raised his bow and shot down, he would only die. Furthermore, he didn't want to run anymore. A person reborn with a heavy sniper rifle was being chased by a primitive man with a bow and arrow. Furthermore, he was being chased in such a wretched manner. He felt very ashamed. If he died like this, he would certainly be laughed at by his predecessors in the underworld, particularly the one surnamed Yi. However, the optical scope still could not capture Yan Xiaoyi's figure. Cold sweat began to drip from Fan Xian's forehead. His figure was also hidden well, but the general area was already grasped by Yan Xiaoyi. There was only so much space near the precipice at the end of the meadow. Yan Xiaoyi would eventually close in on him. The closer Yan Xiaoyi was, the smaller his chances of victory would be. Yan Xiaoyi finally revealed his figure. Like an eagle, he moved along a strange path through the grass. It was clear that although he didn't know what Fan Xian had in his hands, he could clearly understand that he had something that could threaten him. Fan Xian's muzzle extended into the grass and moved endlessly to the side. However, he was still unable to lock onto the quickly moving figure. Although the other person sometimes moved forward and sometimes retreated as if he was drawing a spiral, Fan Xian knew better than anyone else in the world that the spiral would always rise. Yan Xiaoyi was gradually closing the distance between them. 500 meters. The sweat on Fan Xian's forehead dripped faster and faster until it gradually seeped into his eyes. 400 meters. Fan Xian gradually felt a glimmer of helplessness. It was a feeling of emptiness after realizing everything was in his hands was just an illusion. He had no way to kill Yan Xiaoyi with one shot. If Yan Xiaoyi came a little closer, he would certainly be able to use the arrow in his hand to turn him into a porcupine. 350 meters. If he actually allowed Yan Xiaoyi to get close, given Fan Xian's current state, he would not be able to escape from the hands of a 9th-level ace. It was not until this moment that Fan Xian finally understood the meaning of the heavy sniper rifle in his hand. It was meaningless. No matter how powerful a weapon was, it still depended on who held it in their hands. Trying to rely on a heavy sniper rifle to sweep through the world was just the nonsense of an idiot. He couldn't even kill Yan Xiaoyi, much less the strange creatures on the summit of Dong Mountain. Sweat dripped down the small cut on his face made by the grass. There was a wave of piercing pain, but Fan Xian's heart gradually calmed. He knew he couldn't let Yan Xiaoyi continue to get close to him. However, he was unable to use the scope to lock onto that fast-moving figure. At this life-and-death juncture, it seemed he needed some luck. Other than luck, he also needed courage and determination. Yan Xiaoyi. A loud cry came from the meadow at the top of the mountain. Fan Xian, dressed in black, suddenly stood up from the grass. He raised the sniper rifle in his hand and took aim at Yan Xiaoyi, who was not far away. This loud cry startled the ignorant creatures in the meadow. A cunning mountain rabbit began to prepare to run toward the nearest cave. A field mouse chewing on grass stopped its movements underground. Its 2 front limbs hung slightly, ready to run at any moment. Countless birds hiding in the grass began to flap their wings, preparing to fly into this dangerous place. Following this cry, in a flash, Yan Xiaoyi made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Perhaps it was a decision he didn't have time to regret. He stopped his body and used the fastest speed to remove the gold-threaded longbow from his back. With his feet in front and one behind, he stood steadily on the meadow. With all his strength, he pulled the bowstring to a full moon. An icy arrow aimed straight at Fan Xian, who had revealed himself. In this instant, Yan Xiaoyi saw clearly what Fan Xian held in his hand, but he didn't recognize it. Perhaps it was the Overwatch Council's most advanced crossbow. Since Fan Xian had already revealed himself and was beginning to face him head-on with a courage he hadn't displayed for a day and night, Yan Xiaoyi gave Fan Xian this opportunity. It wasn't that Governor Yan was arrogant. He knew that if he maintained a high speed and fired at the same time, he might not be able to hurt the pretty boy who was more cunning than a rabbit, more cowardly than a field mouse, and better at running than a bird. At a distance of 300 feet, as long as he stood firm, he would be able to shoot Fan Xian to death. Even if he couldn't, he wouldn't give Fan Xian any chance to counterattack. As for the strange object in Fan Xian's hand, human psychology was like this. When it came to mysterious and unknown things, there was always a fear of the unknown. That was why Yan Xiaoyi had been so cautious earlier. After he clearly saw that thing made of metal, he naturally thought it was a powerful weapon newly developed by the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Once he knew what it was, he was naturally no longer afraid. This was especially so for an arrogant and conceited peerless expert like Yan Xiaoyi. His decades of immersion in archery and his natural talent gave him sufficient capital to be confident. He always believed that no matter how fast the enemy's crossbow bolt was, it was impossible for it to be faster than his own reaction. Even if he heard the sound of the arrow and dodged the sound of the spring, he would still be completely unharmed. Was there an arrow faster than sound in this world? Yan Xiaoyi didn't believe it, so he coldly stood his ground. Pulling back the longbow, he aimed at Fan Xian and released his finger. The arrow flew out. All of this happened in a very short moment. From Fan Xian bravely standing up from the grass to Yan Xiaoyi steadying himself, to Yan Xiaoyi releasing his fingers, it was just the blink of an eye for a normal person. Fan Xian's speed was clearly not as fast as Yan Xiaoyi's. Only when he clearly saw the arrow spin at high speed and come closer and closer to his body did he pull the trigger forcefully. A spark burst out from the muzzle of the sniper rifle. It was very beautiful. The longbow in Yan Xiaoyi's hand was humming. His posture was still as valiant as a god shooting the sun. Then, his pupils constricted because he saw the spark. He also heard the very clear muffled sound. However, he had no way of dodging it. The other party's arrow was truly faster than sound. With a pop, it was like a paper bag being smashed open by a naughty child. It was like the water bucket used for showering in the old Danzhou manor being smashed open by a rock. Half of Yan Xiaoyi's body split open in an instant. His powerful body and powerful flesh, in this instant, became a flower. A flower dyed the color of blood bloomed on the green meadow. Without surprise, he fell heavily. In this moment, he finally remembered the legend from back then. At the same time, the arrow Yan Xiaoyi had shot pierced viciously into Fan Xian's body. A spray of blood sprayed out and nailed Fan Xian's body firmly to the slightly sloping meadow by the side of the cliff. Time flowed again. The mountain hare burrowed into the narrow cave. The vole put down its front limbs and began to run wildly in the darkness. The birds in the grass also flew up and turned into a vast expanse of white feathers. They fluttered helplessly in the air above the meadow at the top of the mountain. At the two ends of the meadow lay two people fighting to the death. Chapter 533. It was the end of summer. The entire land was enveloped in a high temperature. Although this boundless mountain range was close to the sea, because of the terrain, it could not receive the moisture and coolness carried by the sea wind. It was only stuffy and hot. That was why there was such a strong rotting smell in the mountain forest and so many heart-palpitating dangers. Because the meadow at the top of the mountain faced the sky, it appeared a bit drier. Additionally, the terrain was dangerous, so there were no large carnivores. It was almost noon, and the white sun was spitting out heat as much as it could, generously bestowing most of its heat onto the meadow. The rays of light were so intense that the grass, which was originally green, began to reflect white light. One could imagine how high the temperature was. The small animals had already entered the earth to avoid the heat. The birds had already returned to their nests in the forest halfway up the mountain, waiting to come back the next morning to search for grass seeds to use as food. The entire meadow was quiet and tranquil. Only the occasional mountain breeze would set off waves that alternated between green and white. The porcelain blue background and the comfortable white clouds gently watched these waves. The entire world was very beautiful. If the two humans and the blood that flowed from their bodies did not exist, it would be even more perfect. With a groan, Fan Xian slowly opened his eyes, which were sticky with sweat and blood. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the sky. He found that there seemed to be a spot of light in his eyes that he could not get rid of. He did not react. This was a problem after being illuminated by the blazing sun for a long time. Unconsciously, he stretched out his hand to wave. He found that his right hand was very heavy. It was still tightly gripping the assault rifle. He switched to his left hand to wave. Then, a bone-deep pain made him cry out involuntarily. The pain woke him up. He lowered his eyes slightly and looked at the arrow in his left chest in a daze. The arrow had all pierced in. Only the last feather remained outside his body. Fresh blood flowed out endlessly and dyed the black feather even more bloody. Slightly bending his left leg, he used his right hand with great difficulty to feel for the black dagger in his boot. Very slowly and carefully, he extended it to his back. Following the minuscule gap between his body and the meadow, he gently cut. The shaft of the arrow buried deep in the earth was cut. His body immediately relaxed slightly. However, this slight vibration caused a sharp pain in his chest. His face was deathly pale, and he almost cried out again. Forcefully resisting the pain, he used the dagger to remove most of the arrow sticking out of his chest, leaving only a small head to make it easier to pull the arrow out in the future. After doing all this, the pain had already made him break out in a cold sweat. The sweat even cleanly washed away the blood on his face. He faced the sky and took deep breaths. His eyes were somewhat dazed as he looked at the blue sky and white clouds. He didn't even bother to avoid the dazzling sunlight because he felt that there was nothing better than being alive in this world. If he could never see the sun again, he would regret it so much. Fan Xian's luck was very good. Yan Xiaoyi's arrow accurately hit the left side of his chest, but when the tip of the arrow reached his body, Fan Xian pulled the trigger. Although the recoil of the M82A1 was not strong, it still made his body move back a little. It was because of this that Yan Xiaoyi's arrow had hit a spot slightly higher than he had expected. It had avoided the vital point of his heart and pierced into his left shoulder. As for whether or not Yan Xiaoyi was dead, he didn't want to care. He just felt tired and wanted to lie down like this on this soft meadow, on this isolated mountaintop, and enjoy a rare rest. Besides, if Yan Xiaoyi had not died, given his current state, he could only be killed. Since it was so, why should he care? However, he had to care because there were still many things in the world waiting for him to do. A moment later, a weak figure appeared on the suffocatingly quiet meadow. Fan Xian dragged his heavily injured body. Leaning on the sniper rifle, he walked step by step through the meadow toward the pool of blood. Earlier, Fan Xian had always felt that 300 meters was too close. It was so close that it made his hair stand on end. Now, he felt that 300 meters was very far, so far that it seemed endless. By the time he reached Yan Xiaoyi's side, he was so tired that he almost couldn't stand. His legs were trembling non-stop. The most precious weapon in the world was supporting his entire body's weight. The fine barrel was deeply embedded in the soil. Fan Xian didn't care. No matter how powerful a weapon was, it was actually not much different from a walking stick. If a person couldn't throw away their walking stick, perhaps they would never be able to walk alone. He looked at Yan Xiaoyi in the pool of blood. His eyes narrowed and his brows furrowed. His emotions were complicated. He didn't know what kind of emotion he should feel. The blood had long drained out and seeped into the earth under the green meadow. The upper left side of Yan Xiaoyi's body was completely gone. It had turned into a lump of flesh that couldn't be seen clearly. It looked like a tomato that had been crushed by someone. The red pulp and flesh were sprayed everywhere. It was extremely terrifying. Fan Xian had followed Fei Jia to dig graves and admire corpses since he was young. He had seen countless sinister and terrifying scenes. Looking at the scene in front of him, he still couldn't help but turn his head. It was clear that Fan Xian's shot had still gone askew. However, the powerful power of an anti-material weapon was fully demonstrated at this moment. After receiving such a powerful blow, even a 9th-level ace in this world could only pay the price with his life. Fan Xian calmed his emotions and turned his head. Walking to the side of Yan Xiaoyi's undamaged head, he prepared to extend his hand and close the eyes of this ace who had died with everlasting regret. However, he saw the already scattered pupils and stopped his movements. It was as if he felt that this person was still alive. "Perhaps you can still hear my words," Fan Xian said after a moment of silence. There was an uncontrollable cough in his voice. "I know you think this is unfair, but there has never been any fairness in the matters of this world." Yan Xiaoyi did not have any reaction. His pupils were already scattered as he stared at the sky. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "I didn't kill your son. It was Sigurd. In the future, I will avenge you." No one knew why Fan Xian would tell such a lie next to Yan Xiaoyi's body. In reality, his thoughts were simple. He felt that this kind of death was unfair to Yan Xiaoyi. For such a gifted ace, his death was very unjust. He knew very well what a person would think before they died. For example, what Yan Xiaoyi remembered the most in his heart. If Yan Xiaoyi thought that Fan Xian was Yan Shindu's murderer and Yan Xiaoyi was unable to kill Fan Xian to avenge his son, this ace would probably be extremely upset. These words were just to reassure Yan Xiaoyi's heart. However, Yan Xiaoyi's eyes still did not close. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. He wondered if he was comforting a dead person or himself. In a quiet voice, he said, "What they said was not wrong. You are indeed powerful. You could even try to challenge those strange old creatures. Thus, I have no way of killing you. The one who killed you was not me." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian continued, "This thing is called a gun. It is the essence of a civilization, although this kind of essence is not a good thing for that civilization." Yan Xiaoyi's eyes still did not close. However, a crack came from his neck bone. His head tilted and fell into his own flesh and blood. This 9th-level ace had long died. It was just that his bones had been shattered by the bullet. At this moment, he finally could not bear the weight of his head and fell down like a falling leaf. Fan Xian paused and stared in a daze at the dead person's deathly pale and blood-smeared face. For a long time, he didn't know what to say. After a long time, he raised his head to gaze at the sky. It was as if he wanted to find some trace in the blue sky and white clouds. Those who were good at fighting would die from soldiers, those who were good at swimming would drown, and those who were good at archery would die from arrows. This was a famous saying that people had concluded. Yan Xiaoyi, who was a god of archery, had finally died under a barret. Regardless of whether the ending was fair or not, regardless of whether the process was absurd or not, the pool of flesh and blood on the ground proved the blood and nakedness of this truth. Yan Xiaoyi was the most powerful enemy Fan Xian had killed since his rebirth. He still maintained respect for the pool of flesh and blood on the ground, particularly after a day and night of pursuit. At the last moment of life and death, he finally understood one truth and thought through one thing. This would, without question, be of great use to his life in the future. He was overly afraid of death, so he always did things cautiously and gloomily. He was ruthless and decisive, but he never had Haitong's bright mood or 13th Wang's stubborn courage. It was not until he was forced to the edge of the cliff by Yan Xiaoyi that he truly broke through the darkness in his heart. Bravely, he stood up from the grass and raised the gun in his hand. From then on, he stood up. Maintaining his respect for Yan Xiaoyi, after Fan Xian had gotten used to the pool of flesh and blood, he still began to mercilessly carry out the follow-up work. Taking down the golden silk longbow beside the other person's body, he laboriously dragged the broken body toward the edge of the cliff. Standing at the edge of the cliff, he measured his position and then slowly crouched down on the ground. Picking up a stone, he began to carve the body. The sun was shining brightly. Between the blue sky, white clouds, and green grass, a handsome and pale young man held a stone and hacked endlessly at the body beside him. Blood splattered everywhere. The scene looked disgusting. He pushed the half of Yan Xiaoyi's body and the stone off the cliff. For a long time, there was still no reply. After doing all this, he was unbearably tired. The sharp pain in his chest made it difficult for him to stand. Wretchedly, he sat down on the ground. His head was a little dizzy. He knew that he had to rest and treat his injuries. The flesh and internal organs that remained in the underbrush would be digested by the creatures in this primitive forest in just a few days, and he still had to eliminate the traces left behind by the sniper rifle. He coughed, making the little arrow piercing his heart tremble slightly. A heart-wrenching pain spread out and made him involuntarily give a muffled grunt. It was not at the same time. On the summit of Dong Mountain, far away from the wondrous meadow on the summit, the Qing Emperor, who was trapped in the Qing temple, looked through the window at the warm morning light outside in a daze. "I wonder if the child will be able to safely return to Jingdou," he said slowly. This was probably the first time the Qing Emperor had shown such gentleness toward Fan Xian in front of outsiders. Eunuch Hong smiled slightly. His deep wrinkles were filled with calmness. It was as if there were no 5,000 powerful rebel soldiers at the foot of the mountain or a great grandmaster wearing a straw hat slowly walking up the stairway to heaven. Sir Fan Jr. is a genius. There are no extraordinary figures outside of Dong Mountain, Eunuch Hong said warmly. It shouldn't be difficult on the road. What is important is after he returns to the capital. The matters in Jingdou are not difficult to deal with. The Qing Emperor smiled slightly. I like this child more and more. This time, I will see him again. Eunuch Hong sighed in his heart. Since he liked him, why continue to doubt and tempt him? How different was this from what he had done to the second prince in the past? The emperor stopped talking about the illegitimate child who had escaped. Turning to look at Eunuch Hong, he calmly said, "This time, I will be relying on you." Eunuch Hong's body remained bent. After a moment of silence, he slowly said, "I am a servant of the Qing kingdom. Since the founding of the country, I have always hoped that the Qing court could unify the world. It is my good fortune to be able to serve the emperor." This was not an expression of loyalty. There was no need for such superfluous words between the emperor and an old eunuch. Even now, with the army surrounding the mountain, Eunuch Hong still spoke slowly. It was as if he urgently wanted to tell his thoughts to the emperor. The emperor looked calmly at Hong Xiang. The expression on his face gradually became serious. A moment later, he raised his hands in a salute and bowed toward Eunuch Hong. Given the emperor's supreme status, bowing to a eunuch was an unimaginable sight. However, Hong Xiang was unmoved. He calmly and even coldly accepted the bow. The emperor straightened his body. A determined expression rose to his face. "What I promised to you, to Qing Kingdom, to the world. In the future, I will let you see." The sky had long brightened. The thick fog had long dissipated. The rebel army camp was on a small slope behind a few rows of trees at the foot of Dong Mountain. The black-clothed commander of the rebel army calmly watched the activity outside the mountain gate. His calm gaze was filled with peace. There was not a glimmer of excitement. No more attacks. It's useless. The black-clothed commander spoke calmly to the people beside him as if he was talking about a trivial family matter. His attitude was warm but left no room for doubt. Carrying a long sword on his back, Yunjilan glanced at this mysterious figure and furrowed his brows slightly. Although he didn't agree with the other party's judgment, he didn't say anything to refute it. The attack on Dong Mountain this time was like a thunderstorm that was destined to shake the world. As a master swordsman, Yunjilan didn't want to have any influence on the overall situation because of himself. It was quiet by the mountain gate. The remaining hundreds of imperial soldiers had already retreated behind the mountain gate. The 5,000 longbowmen of the rebel army had attacked several times but were completely beaten back by the defensive power in the mountain forest. The ones launching the attack this time were the attacking troops with the aces of Dongyi as the core. Yunjilan had great confidence in the strength of the disciples of the Sword Hut. He thought that with them leading the archers in a powerful attack, even if the Qing Emperor's most powerful tiger guards were hidden in the forest behind the mountain gate, they would still be torn open. Furthermore, the valiant disciple of the imperial army, when faced with his fellow disciples from Dongyi, was he going to continue attacking? In the morning, the birds were startled. With a crash, they charged out of the forest and tore off a few green leaves. One could imagine how frightened the birds were after a night of rest. What startled the birds was the snowy light that lit up the sky. Each piece of snow was a knife. A long knife that killed mercilessly. The snowy light filled the sky. No one knew how many soul-eating long knives danced at the same time to create such a bleak and terrifying scene. Knife chi crisscrossed through the forest. In an instant, it spilled out completely, invading the normally sturdy but now incomparably weak forest trees. Countless tree bark and tree trunks were shaved off and shot out with a pitter-patter. They hit the dirt with a thud. Countless muffled groans and wretched cries rang out in an instant. Blood sprayed freely in the forest. Broken limbs were thrown into the sky and fell toward the ground. It was the first time they had encountered a battle, yet it had progressed so wretchedly. It could be seen that when the knife-wielding men were forced into their final predicament, they had finally exploded with their most powerful strength. Yunjilan's pupils constricted. He knew that the black-clothed commander's judgment was indeed correct. He didn't wait any longer. With a wave of his hand, he sent out an arrow of command. The aces of Dongyi led the remaining rebel soldiers and barely managed to retreat out of the forest in defeat. Looking at the situation, it would be more appropriate to call it a rout. In just a few breaths of time, the rebel soldiers attacking the mountain gate had suffered 70% of their casualties. Even the aces of Dongyi had lost 5 people. Yunjilan's heart ached. He didn't know what to say. Dongyi did not have large numbers of soldiers like the Qing kingdom and northern Qi. Their most powerful force was the group of swordsmen raised by the Sword Hut. Even if only 5 people had died, it was still a heavy blow. He knew that the defensive power at the Qing Emperor's side was terrifying, but he had never thought that the other party's mountain defense would be so powerful. It's the Tiger Guards. The black-clothed man on the horse looked at him and calmly said, "Legend has it that the 7 Tiger Guards at Sir Fan Jr.'s side working together can force Lady Haitang to retreat on this quiet Dong Mountain." He smiled slightly. "There are 100 Tiger Guards. Other than the first experiment, this is the first time I've used the Chidian author system for a scheduled update. When I finished writing this paragraph, it was 9:00 in the morning. When everyone sees this chapter, it should be 4:50 in the afternoon. I'm already on a plane to Shanghai. Yes, Chidian is about to hold its annual writers' conference. There are many people like me in the country who are rushing in the direction of Shanghai. The conference will end on the 23rd, but I won't go home immediately because I have to go north. Because of the sentence before, devastatingly beautiful, until the middle of July, my life will be on the road. The reason I didn't ask everyone for leave earlier is because I don't need to ask for leave. Ha ha ha, I used my monthly vote bonus to buy a book. I will keep updating. If I can't, I will definitely let everyone know ahead of time. However, because of the interference of many matters on the road, I don't dare to keep a stable time for updates. I ask for everyone's forgiveness for this. I was very satisfied with yesterday's chapter. It's not that I'm narcissistic. It's just that my ability and the effect I wrote were very consistent. Is there a problem? It's really nothing because there has never been an omniscient and omnipotent person in this world. I'm just a pitiful person writing. Rationality is not the key. It's more important to be self-consistent. It's basically impossible to write a novel every day without making mistakes. So, in this area, I've always been very good at forgiving myself. I'm a person who treats myself very generously and treats others very generously. Of course, Fan Xian is the hometown wish, but I'm not. I'm a good person. Amit Ba. Just like the introduction in Zhu Kg said, of course, this is a YY novel. It's just a YY novel. Everyone reads it happily or passionately. I can pass some of my leisure time after work. That is the source of my sense of accomplishment. Chapter 534. The Great Dong Mountain was the most beautiful and strange mountain peak in the world. It faced the sea and had its back to the land. In front of it was a smooth jade-like cliff. Behind it was a green mountain forest nourished by fertile land. In people's rational thinking, it was impossible for anyone to go up or down from that smooth cliff. However, this record had been broken by the Qing commissioner the night before. The front of Dong Mountain was still dangerous. Other than a long set of stone steps that rose steeply into the clouds, there was no other path. If they wanted to forcefully attack, they could only follow this path. The narrowest place was often a place where one man held the pass and 10,000 could not pass. It could truly be said to be a dangerous place that was easy to defend and difficult to attack. The reason the rebel army had chosen to surround Dong Mountain was because they were thinking in reverse. Since the mountain was difficult to go up, if the army surrounded the mountain, it would also be difficult for the people on the mountain to come down. Up until now, the rebel army's control of the situation was very good. The Qing Emperor's side had tried to break through the encirclement a number of times, but they had ruthlessly and mercilessly beaten them back. After beating them back to the mountain gate, the key points at the foot of Dong Mountain were all controlled by the rebel army. The rebel army had not thought that although they had surrounded it, they would not be able to take even half a step up the mountain. There were 100 tiger guards on Dong Mountain. If one were to do a simple math problem, it would take at least 14 Haitangs to be able to face these powerful Qing Emperor guards head-on. In reality, there was only one Haitang in the entire world. Furthermore, beside the tiger guards was 13th Wang, who had some of the bravery and heroism in his stupidity that had long ceased to exist in this world. With such a powerful force of guards and the strange terrain of Dong Mountain, even if the rebel army elites had successfully surrounded the mountain, it would still be as difficult as climbing to the sky to forcefully attack and reach the top. It was just like the name of the long stone path, the stairway to heaven. If one wished to ascend to heaven, how could mortals do it? Thus, the commander of the rebel army shrouded in black decisively gave the order to pause all attacks. He only continued to strengthen the patrols and lockdowns around the foot of the mountain. After giving this order, he turned around and gently patted the back of his horse. Calmly, he said to Yun Jilan beside him, "At such a grand moment in history, people like you and me sometimes only have the right to be quiet spectators." This was an era where martial arts flourished. It was an era where the individual's strength was almost at the level of the heaven realm. 30 years ago, there had never been a great grandmaster in the world. It was only after the great grandmasters appeared that people realized that individual strength could be so powerful. Because of their strength, these great grandmasters could influence the world. It was also because of this that these great grandmasters often lived in seclusion. They were afraid that their words and actions would bring turmoil to the world and affect the lives and deaths of the people they wanted to protect. This place was the mysterious and beautiful Dong Mountain. At the summit was the Qing Emperor. It seemed that only a great grandmaster had the right to act. Once a great grandmaster made a move, those valiant generals who dominated a region and those great swordsmen who dominated the world would naturally retreat to the back. Their brilliance would be completely suppressed, like a piece of coal that could not emit light. They could only hope to be qualified to witness history. Just like this moment. The long stone steps seemed to have no end. Very high up, one could faintly see the mountain mist drifting. A person wearing hemp clothing and a straw hat stood calmly on the first step of the stone steps at the foot of Dong Mountain. The stone steps were covered in blood. Some were dried and some were fresh. They carried all kinds of unpleasant smells. Who knew how many imperial soldiers and rebel soldiers had paid with their lives here for every inch of gain or loss? However, the person only stood calmly. It was as if he was not stepping on blood steps but white clouds. The mountain wind picked up. The person's figure was faintly discernible and lofty like an immortal. It was as if he wanted to ride the clouds up 3,000 feet. He didn't want to go to the heavenly palace. Instead, he wanted to go to the temple at the summit. When the person wearing the straw hat appeared on the first step, the two armies inside and outside the mountain fell silent at the same time. There wasn't even a cry of surprise. It was as if they were afraid of offending this figure. The black-clothed man and Yunjilan, who had been sitting on their horses the entire time, quietly dismounted. They bowed slightly toward the back of the ordinary hemp-clothed figure to show respect. They knew that this figure had already come to the foot of the mountain last night, but they didn't know how he had appeared in front of them. However, they didn't need to be surprised. For such a person to appear in this world was the most inexplicable thing to begin with. The rebel soldiers did not make any more movements. After a moment of silence, the Tiger Guards, Imperial soldiers, and Overwatch Council in the forest seemed to become flustered and helpless. No matter how loyal they were to the Emperor and their country, they had never thought of directly opposing this person, particularly the people of the Qing Kingdom. They had always seen this exceptional master, who liked to ride boats on the ocean, as the protector of the Qing Kingdom. However, this god was going to ascend the mountain in defiance of the Emperor's edict. Everyone knew what his goal was. The Tiger Guards became nervous. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council felt their mouths go dry. The Imperial soldiers were so shocked that they almost lost their grip on the weapons in their hands. To fight with a god was already beyond most people's imagination and mental limits. Furthermore, they knew that although the opponent was only one person, he was more terrifying than thousands of soldiers and horses. Even if he did not have a sword in his hand. Yi Luyun, wearing the straw hat, did not have a sword in his hand. No one knew if there was a sword in his heart. Last night, his sword had already pierced through the sometimes calm and sometimes angry ocean at the foot of Dong Mountain. It had pierced through layers of white waves, flattened a reef, and injured Fan Xian's heart meridian. In the end, it had pierced with unstoppable killing into the rock wall that was harder than metal and stone. The entire sword had disappeared, leaving only a slightly protruding hilt in the rock wall. However, everyone under heaven knew that Great Grandmaster Yi Luyun was even more terrifying without a sword in his hand. In those legends, Yi Luyun resolutely abandoned his sword because of an unknown story. He comprehended flowing cloud hands in the clouds and entered the realm of a great grandmaster. Yi Luyun had already stepped onto the second stone step. Finally, the Tiger Guards hidden in the forest behind the mountain gate reacted. The first thing to welcome this great grandmaster up the mountain was the shrill and powerful rain of crossbow bolts. This was the Overwatch Council's weapon of mass destruction. It was the repeating crossbow that had once appeared on the southern plains of Zhangzhou. With such a short distance between them, who would be able to dodge it? The black-clothed man and Yunjilan watched this scene from the distant flat ground outside the mountain gate without blinking. Of course, they were not worried about Yi Liuyun's life or death. No one thought a mere rain of crossbow bolts would be able to stop a great grandmaster. They just didn't want to miss the scene of the great grandmaster, who usually appeared like a divine dragon, personally taking action. The black-clothed man thought to himself that if it was him facing such an urgent rain of crossbow bolts, he would probably be injured. Yunjilan was thinking about how his teacher would respond. Yi Luyun faced the crossbow bolts that were about to strike his body and only waved his hand. This wave was like a mountain pine chasing the clouds, unwilling to have its beautiful appearance covered by the white fog. This wave was like a drop of rain piercing through the clouds, unwilling to have the black clouds cut off its chance to get close to the earth. The strangest feeling this wave gave everyone watching was that it was natural, gentle, determined, and fast. Two completely opposite attributes fused perfectly and vividly with this simple wave of his hand. Where the hand landed, the crossbow bolts gently fell to the ground. The crossbow bolts that shot out at high speed met that hand like clouds flying strangely slowly. They were slowly plucked off one by that hand and then thrown into the dust. The black-clothed man's heart chilled. In a quiet voice, he said, "I can't see his hand clearly." Yunjilan was silent. He had wanted to see which realm was higher between this Qing Kingdom great grandmaster and his teacher. Unexpectedly, he didn't understand anything. Given his and the mysterious black-clothed man's eyesight, they only understood one thing. The gentle Luyun released his hand so quickly that it could be used gently. Yet, no one was able to catch the trajectory of the fingertips. Not just fast. The man in black muttered to himself, "The cloud is in existence with the most shapes, so his hands are gentle yet terrifying." In Suzhou, in Baoyue brothel, Yi Luyun had once used a pair of chopsticks to swat away Fan Xian's crossbow bolts like he was swatting away mosquitoes. Now, at the foot of the Great Dong Mountain Gate, his wave of one hand was even more ingenious. He walked up another step. The light of the knife shone brightly. In June, the stone path of Dong Mountain was like flying snow. The power of the snow headed straight for the straw hat. Countless tiger guards summoned their courage in this instant because of the responsibility and fear in their hearts and chose to attack at the same time. The long knives danced in the air. The power of the knife was enough to break the sky. It enveloped Yi Liuyun's entire body. At the same time, such a powerful knife power layered on top of each other could completely chop Fan Xian and Hai Tang into pieces. However, it didn't hit Yi Luyun. On the stone path, there was only a twisted and unpleasant sound of metal scraping against each other. Yi Liuyun's straw hat was still on his head, but his body was like a wisp of smoke. In an instant, he passed through the layers of knife light and suddenly came to the top of the stone steps, leaving the tiger guards behind him. He shook his arms, and the two metal objects in his hands fell onto the stone steps. They rolled down more than a dozen steps with a crisp clang, and then fell apart. It was only then that the crowd realized that the metal that looked like fried dough twists were actually long sabers slashed out by 6 or 7 tiger guards. Luyun was strong enough to bind gold and bind stones. After Great Grandmaster Yi Luyun perfectly displayed his realm that far surpassed the secular world, he stood quietly on the stone steps. Suddenly, his body swayed. A corner of his hemp clothing was blown by the wind and left his clothes. A piece of hemp cloth floated up in the mountain wind and swirled above the stone steps. At some point, a young man with dried blood and clear eyes holding a green banner in his hand had appeared in front of him. 13th Wang. A gust of wind blew past. The layer of clouds covering the summit of the mountain seemed to be blown away, revealing an indistinct corner of the temple. A muffled sound came from the stone steps. Yi Luyun pulled back his hand and lowered his head to look at the broken green banner by his feet. A glimmer of confusion and a smile flashed through his calm eyes. He then coughed. 13th Wang was still flying in the air. Fresh blood sprayed out habitually. His body drew a long arc as he fell dejectedly into the forest, smashing heavily into a large tree far to the right of the stone steps. Even a 9th-level ace was not a match for a great grandmaster. Yi Luyun coughed. A glimmer of worry flashed through the black-clothed man's eyes. He knew that after Yi Luyun had seemingly defeated the Tiger Guards and the powerful young 9th-level ace, he was still affected. He knew that given the great grandmaster's realm, he should not be injured. However, Yi Luyun had purposely left some leeway in his 3 attacks. Faced with the Qing Emperor's subordinates and aces whose eyes were red with fear and anger, there would always be some problems. The great grandmasters were the people closest to gods. After all, they were not gods. They had their own countries, particularly Yi Luyun. Even though he had come to commit regicide for his family, he was still so gentle that he would not harm the people of the Qing kingdom. Then, he saw the piece of hemp cloth on the great grandmaster's robe gently float down and land in front of him. His steed was curious and went to sniff it. Chapter 535. At the summit of Dong Mountain, the morning fog had already dispersed. The mountain wind blew strongly. The clouds parted, and the true appearance of the temple appeared. Dressed in a bright yellow dragon robe, the Qing Emperor stood quietly by the railing, waiting for Yi Luyun's arrival. When the foot of the mountain was surrounded by 5,000 longbowmen, particularly when traces of Dong Yi's 9th-level aces appeared among the rebel soldiers, the Qing Emperor, who had always calculated everything, seemed to have finally realized that, for the first time, the situation was beginning to get out of his control. A faint worry rose between the middle-aged man's brows. A bell rang out in the group of old temples with round black eaves. It refreshed the mind and moved the soul. It calmed one's mind and made the world restless. The edict used for the worship to heaven burned in the furnace. Green smoke rose in spirals. The various crimes of the crown prince that the Qing emperor had listed seemed to have already been offered to the illusory temple and the even more illusory will of heaven. The Qing emperor's most important mission had been completed during the worship to heaven. All he needed to do was bring the groundless revelation from heaven back to Jingdo, depose the crown prince, and then pick a suitable successor. A straw hat slowly crossed the line of the last stone step at the summit of Dong Mountain and suddenly appeared in front of the group of Qing officials in front of the temple. The emperor looked calmly in that direction. He looked at the simple and unremarkable face under the straw hat. He looked at the clear and gentle eyes like autumn water. Slowly, he said, "Uncle Luyun, you're late." Yi Luyun walked up the mountain step by step. No one could stop him. He faced the temple quietly and didn't speak for a long time. The officials and priests on the summit, including the minister of the Board of Rites and Ren Xiaoyan, all unconsciously lowered their bodies and bowed to this great grandmaster of the Qing kingdom. In front of Yi Luyun, only the Qing emperor stood as straight as usual. Although old eunuch Hong, who never left his side, was hunched over, everyone knew that this old eunuch was always hunched over. It was as if he was watching ants walk on the ground. It was not because he wanted to show respect to Yi Luyun. "How can you say I'm late?" Yi Luyun looked at the emperor and sighed. His tone was filled with indescribable helplessness and regret. "Has your majesty received the mandate of heaven on this journey to worship heaven?" "The will of heaven is upon me. Since I am not afraid of hardships and dangers, I have traveled thousands of li to come to Dong Mountain. Naturally, my wishes will come true," the emperor said coldly. Yi Luyun slightly lowered his head and thought for a moment before saying, something like destiny is always hard to fathom. Although your majesty isn't an ordinary person, you shouldn't rashly mete out punishment on behalf of heaven. The emperor looked coldly at Yi Luyun, who was over 100 feet away, and said, Uncle, are you here today just to admonish me and not to vent the anger of the heavens? Yi Luyun laughed bitterly as he slowly raised his right arm. The cuffs of his sleeves were slightly pulled back, revealing his spotless right hand. His fingers were smooth and clean, definitely not a limb that an old man should have. His right hand pointed at the pool of blood in front of the Qing temple, as well as the Qing temple priests in the pool of blood. Your Majesty, you're the one who's angry. Yi Luyun said compassionately, the priests are the ascetic monks who serve the temple. Even they know that His Majesty's sacrifice to the heavens is a random order. The ruler has a random order that officials cannot accept, and the sacrifice cannot be accepted. That is why you killed them. The Crown Prince's edict for the Emperor's sacrifice to the heavens came from the hands of the internal court. The chosen crimes were only vague matters such as salivation, having a concubine, and misconduct. This was what the Crown Prince had done many years ago. It was completely different from the steady and filial Crown Prince now. In all the previous dynasties and generations of deposed Crown Princes, there had never been such a muddle-headed edict, such as a ridiculous sacrifice to the heavens. The Qing Temple on Dong Mountain had a long history. Although it was not in Jingdo, the Qing Temple priests often cultivated there. Following the great priest's strange death and the second priest's great master Sansher's death from an arrow, the Qing Temple's power, which had already been weakened beyond recognition by the Qing Emperor, became even weaker. Thus, all the way from the mountain gate to the mountain, the priests of the Qing Temple on Dong Mountain appeared humble and obedient. When the Qing Emperor formally began the process of offering sacrifices to the heavens to denounce the Crown Prince, there were still some priests who bravely stood out and expressed their opposition with vehement words. They also solemnly pointed out that the Qing Temple would never become a sharp blade in the hands of an incapable emperor. The court's secret encroachment on the Qing Temple and the deaths of the two leading priests made the priests of the Qing Temple on Dong Mountain feel boundless anger. The arrival of the rebel army at the foot of the mountain gave these people boundless courage. Thus, these priests became a few corpses in front of the Black Eve's temple. Their courage became a puddle of blood that attracted flies. When someone disobeyed the emperor's edict, he was never afraid to kill them, even if they were the priests on Dong Mountain. The only people the Qing emperor didn't dare kill were those he temporarily couldn't, such as Yi Luyun. The emperor calmly watched Yi Luyun by the stone steps and said, Uncle, you are not a foolish commoner. You know that these priests are only mortals. Even if I kill them, what does that have to do with the will of heaven? Yi Luyun furrowed his brows slightly and said, even if the priests are mortals, this temple is not ordinary. Presumably, your majesty knows better than me. When you kill people at the front door of the temple and the blood flows into the steps, are you not worried about heaven's wrath? The emperor's expression was indifferent. He placed his hands behind his back. A moment later, he said each word clearly, you and I live in this world, but it is not the end of heaven. Thus, in my life, I have never respected ghosts or gods. I only respect you, uncle. Yi Luyun was silent and speechless. The emperor turned his body and calmly looked at the black eaves of the temple. The old tiles on the eaves shone with a solemn luster under the morning sun. Thus, I have invited an old friend to meet you. There were not many people in this world who had the right to be called Yi Luyun's old friend by the Qing emperor. There were only a handful of them. When the bell of the Qing temple rang out again and the wooden door to the side courtyard creaked open, a gust of mountain wind swept past the summit. Wu Zhu, with a piece of black cloth tied around his neck, walked out from inside the door. Yi Luyun only smiled. Of course, there was an additional hint of emotion and bitterness in his smile. It has been many years since we parted in Danzhou. I haven't heard news of you for over 2 years. He gazed at Wu Zhu and amiably said, I had thought you had already returned. I didn't expect you to be on Dong Mountain. In the summer of 2 years ago, the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor Ku he had been injured in a secret duel. As one of the 4 great grandmasters, Yi Luyun could guess that the one who had done it was Wu Zhu. That was why he had said that he hadn't heard news of you for over 2 years. Yi Luyun's words, I thought you had already returned, hid too much of his meaning. However, other than him and Wu Zhu, perhaps no one else in this world could understand. Fan Xian was far away on the cliff in Danzhou and did not hear the conversation at the bottom of the cliff. Wu Zhu, as usual, was neat and tidy. After saying these 2 words, he stood at the door to the little courtyard and didn't take another step toward the scene. He faced Yi Luyun from a distance, but he was closer to the emperor. The 2 words he said were, hello. It was just these 2 words, but they shocked Yi Luyun even more than when he had come out of the courtyard. He was even more moved. He couldn't help but laugh in a comforting manner. The laughter was very sincere. Then, the laughter suddenly stopped. Yi Luyun turned to face the emperor and bowed slightly. He sighed in admiration and said, Your Majesty's foresight is divine. No wonder there was a trip to Dong Mountain for the heaven worship. Even this strange creature was dug out by you. Even if I didn't want to admire you, I had no choice. Hearing these words, the emperor's expression did not change at all. On the contrary, the corners of his brows twitched a little. Yes, the heaven worship had always been a trap targeted at Yi Luyun. When Wu Zhu, the vanguard of the trap, stood out, Yi Luyun did not react as if he had fallen into the trap. A glimmer of worry flashed through the emperor's eyes and then disappeared. Presumably, he knew that the major event he and Fan Xian guessed was finally about to become reality. The emperor glanced at old eunuch Hong beside him. His gaze was calm, but it contained many meanings. It was as if he was asking why he didn't immediately act. Given the great grandmaster's realm, even if it was 2 against 1, if they couldn't seize the moment earlier when Yi Luyun's guard had loosened because of Wu Zhu's mysterious appearance, it would still be a difficult task to kill Yi Luyun on the mountain. Eunuch Hong completely ignored the emperor's gaze. His gaze was unusually hot as it stared forward. It passed through Yi Luyun's shoulders and shot straight into the mountain forest below the stone steps. He took half a step forward and stood in front of the emperor's body. He then slowly straightened his body. Eunuch Hong, who seemed to have been bent over his entire life, suddenly straightened his body. It was this simple change in action. An indescribable aura began to surge into his body and spread out with unusual majesty toward the summit of the mountain. Everyone knew that Eunuch Hong's body had not grown larger. In this instant, everyone had the illusion that Eunuch Hong had become an undefeatable god. His entire body gave off a piercing light that completely covered the Qing emperor behind him. The strength of this wave of Jinqi had even faintly surpassed the limits of what a mortal's physical body could contain. It was extremely tyrannical. The endless falling trees rustled down, and the endless great river surged forth. This was the first poem Fan Xian had copied in Jingdou. Regardless of whether the characters for the great river were appropriate or not, this poem had already spread throughout the world. The people who were lucky or unlucky to be on Dong Mountain all thought of the first half of this poem in an instant. This was because they sensed a surge of sword qi that soared into the sky, wreaking havoc in the forest below the stone steps. Even the distant mountain peaks were invaded by this extremely fierce sword qi. The green trees began to shed their leaves for no reason, and the fallen leaves formed a green pile. Yi Luyun looked at Eunuch Hong and said, "You are a beautiful person. How can you be a slave?" Eunuch Hong's silver-white hair floated in the wind. In a raspy voice, he said, "Great grandmasters are all slaves. I am the Emperor's slave. You are also nothing more than slaves of this world. What is the difference? Chapter 536. In this moment, Gauda thought he was flying. He flew past the layers of green forest on the mountainside of Dong Mountain, the faint mist in the forest, and the swiftly flying crossbow bolts. He flew higher and higher. The higher he flew, the further he could see. In that instant, Gauda saw the mountain gate at the foot of the mountain. He saw the long stone path, the blood stains on the green stone slabs, the flashing knife light in the forest, and the snake-like shadow of a sword beside the stone path. Then he fell heavily, breaking who knows how many twigs. He hit the wet ground of the forest with a thud, and almost fell off the steep mountain bank. Gauda gave a muffled grunt and used the Jinchi in his body to forcefully resist this attack. His entire body bounced up like a spring. His hands gripped the hilt of the long knife tightly. Raising his foot, he prepared to charge toward the stone path of death again. Then, with one movement, he felt all the bones in his body shatter at the same time. A muffled grunt came from his nose. The pain was unbearable. At the same time, 2 streams of blood seeped out of his nose. Gauda's legs weakened. He unconsciously turned his hand and stabbed the long knife into the ground beside him to support his body. Unexpectedly, the moment the tip of the knife touched the muddy ground, it shattered into countless pieces of metal in an instant. Amidst the crisp clanging sounds, Gauda fell wretchedly into the muddy ground in the forest. Beside him were pieces of the knife. In his hand, he held the pitiful remnants of the knife hilt. His eyes were filled with shock and terror. He had been sent flying by a person and a sword. As Fan Xian's personal guard, Gauda had the strength of an 8th-level martial artist. Back in the northern Qi Palace, he had forced back the enemy with one strike. How impressive was that? Even among the tiger guards of the palace, he was one of the few aces. Unexpectedly, he had been sent flying by a sword like he was swatting a mosquito. Gauda's gaze was complicated as he looked at the sword light on the distant stone path. His heart darkened. This time, Fan Xian had brought 7 of the tiger guards to Danzhou. Unexpectedly, they had been brought to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Then, they encountered the assassination attempt. As a tiger guard, their first duty was to protect the emperor's safety. Although Gauda didn't know that Sir Fan Jr. had already quietly slipped down the cliff, he still led the other 6 tiger guards and joined the group of palace guards. They began to carry out the most merciless killing on this precipitous stone path. 100 tiger guards guarded a mountain path. Logically speaking, there were no aces in the world who could break through and ascend the mountain. However, in this world, there were always a few existences that did not abide by logic. For example, the great grandmaster of the Qin kingdom, Yi Luyun, who had turned into a flowing cloud and passed by, or the person holding a sword in his hand and killing gods on the stone path. His sword intent had already reached a peak. Gauda swallowed the sweet saliva in his mouth and forcefully calmed his breathing. As he listened to the sounds on the stone path grow softer and softer, he knew that his brothers had probably already died at the hands of that great grandmaster. The most basic requirement to be a tiger guard was loyalty to the emperor. Even though they knew that they were facing the strongest power in the world, they still resolutely stood on the stone path and stood in front of the emperor. Their blood splashed and their chests were cut open. They risked their lives and did not take a single step back. Therefore, the Gundam, at this moment, its first reaction was to charge forward again and block the path of that terrifying big shot, becoming another wandering soul under the other party's sword. Even if he was already heavily injured and his knife had been shattered into small pieces. However, the Gundam hesitated for a moment. On the long and bloody stone path, countless tiger guards tried to surround the figure with 7 people and used the methods they used to deal with 9th-level aces in their daily training to deal with that figure. However, all of their efforts were futile. The sword that seemed to have come from the netherworld and carried an indomitable aura was only gently waved and suffused with a heavy murderous aura as it sliced through people's knives, arms, and heads. The reason Gauda was still alive after flying over was because he had been influenced too much by Fan Xian these 2 years. Involuntarily, his murderous long knife carried the dark imprint of Fan Xian's little tricks. He no longer blindly killed and did not retreat a single step. Even when facing that figure, Gauda was still not his match. His meridians were about to be torn apart by the sword intent, but he still survived. Since he had survived, was he still going to send himself to death? No. A strange light flashed through Gauda's eyes. Sir Fan Jr. had said countless times that no matter what, he had to first keep his life before he had a chance to redeem it. The Great Dong Mountain was surrounded. If he charged over again and died on the stone path, it would be useless. He covered his mouth with his hand and allowed the blood to flow out between his fingers. He didn't make a single sound. He gazed at the bottom of the forest. It was clear that the rebel army's defensive circle had relaxed a little because of the arrival of 2 figures in succession. Gauda gritted his teeth. His eyes were filled with determination. He decided to find an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. From the moment he made this decision, he was no longer just a tiger guard of the royal family. He had not thought that his decision would bring so much shock to the world 2 years later. Drip, drip. The drop of blood slowly fell. It was a very small sound, but it was ear-piercing. It made the people present feel that the sound of the dripping blood was even more cleansing than the sound of the bell in the old temple behind them. The drop of blood was dripping from the tip of a sword. This sword slowly rose and passed the last stone step, appearing in front of the eyes of the people on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword was very normal and didn't look strange. Even the hilt was casually tied with a layer of hemp rope. It looked a bit old and worn. However, it was precisely this ordinary sword that did not reflect much light on the surface of the sword that shone with a trace of power and coldness that made everyone feel fear. Especially when the blood on the sword slowly gathered at the tip of the sword and then slowly fell down. It was as if everyone who saw this sword felt as if the blood at the tip of their hearts was flowing out of their bodies through this process. Their faces all paled. Then he saw the hand that held the sword, the person. The person wearing a straw hat and hemp clothing was not very tall. On the contrary, he appeared to be a bit short. He was the complete opposite of Yi Liuyun's confident and untainted image. Because this figure was short, his hemp clothing was in tatters, and his entire body was covered in dust and blood from the tears in his clothing. In his hand, he held a blood-stained, worn-out sword. He appeared incomparably wretched. However, no one laughed because of this wretched feeling. They knew that when this figure killed, he was ruthless. In terms of terror, he was even more terrifying than Yi Luyun. Old Eunuch Hong looked calmly at the wretched swordsman ascending the steps and smiled slightly. He then slowly withdrew the tyrannical aura he had released. His entire body bent down and returned to the appearance of an old eunuch. The Qing Emperor looked at the stone steps with a cold expression. He looked at Yi Luyun and the newcomer and took a gentle step forward. Calmly, he said, "Looks like Yunrui has invested a lot this time. However, uncle, are you going crazy with her? Betraying the country for the sake of the family is truly unexpected." Since that terrifying figure was standing with Yi Luyun, it meant that the most powerful old creatures had already joined hands and made a decision. They could not allow the most powerful emperor since the founding of the Qing kingdom to continue living. Yi Luyun smiled warmly. He didn't explain or defend himself. Ever since that terrifying figure holding a sword had come up the cliff, everyone had been silent, terrified of disturbing that person. However, the Qing Emperor was not afraid at all. He smiled coldly as he stared at the hemp clothing full of holes. Mockingly, he said, "Sigurd, what are you doing on Dong Mountain instead of retiring in the grass hut? Look at your wretched appearance. You killed all of my tiger guards. Did you think you wouldn't have to pay a price? An idiot is an idiot. The Qing kingdom cured your insanity. It's fine if you don't think about repaying the favor, but you insist on using your sword to kill your way up the mountain and waste your Zhenqi. It looks like after all these years, your brain hasn't gotten any better." A short man with a broken sword and wretched clothes had killed his way up the endless stone steps and killed hundreds of tiger guards. In the entire world, there was only Sigurd, who only cared about what was in front and not behind, who pressed forward with an indomitable sword intent, and who single-handedly protected Dongyi and the small vassal states for 20 years. No one dared to be disrespectful to Sigurd. Only the Qing Emperor dared to speak to him in such a tone. However, when these mocking words fell into the ears of those who paid attention, they heard a hint of being strong in appearance but weak in heart. No one dared to not reply to the Qing Emperor's question. However, Sigurd couldn't even be bothered to glance at the Qing Emperor. He only stared in a daze at old eunuch Hong beside the Emperor. Gradually, the great Grandmaster's gaze grew hot. It was as if they were going to pierce through the shadow under the straw hat and melt old eunuch Hong's old face. The short Sigurd opened his mouth. His voice was not like his body. It was as loud as a large bell. His voice could split pine, but it trembled with excitement. "It was you just now, wasn't it? What tyrannical Zhenqi?" Sigurd looked at old eunuch Hong in a daze. "I know Fan Xian also walks this path. So, you are his teacher. Speaking of which, the person who showed power in the royal palace in Jingdo a dozen years ago was you. The rumors under heaven are indeed reasonable." The Qing Emperor was ignored by this great grandmaster. Although the Emperor did not get angry, his gaze gradually became icy. Looking at Sigurd, he said, "You have tried to assassinate me 3 times. You didn't even see my face before retreating miserably. Is there some unexpected joy this time?" It seemed that Sigurd had only just heard the Qing Emperor's words. His gaze shifted slightly and looked at the Qing Emperor's face. After a moment of silence, he suddenly shook his head. "You are far less handsome than your son. What is there to look at?" The Emperor smiled slightly and said, "Naturally, I am talking about Enji. Have you seen him?" Sigurd tilted his head and said, "I have a female disciple called LVCC. Her senior sister disciple was clearly killed by Fan Xian, but after seeing Fan Xian from afar in Hangzhou, she forgot her grudge and became infatuated. Every day, she holds up some Banxian's book and reads it. Speaking of which, Fan Xian, that pretty boy, is not bad." The sea breeze blew gently through the summit of the mountain. The Qing Emperor laughed loudly and said, "You Dongyi people are indeed all infatuated." Sigurd thought for a moment and then said seriously, "I am an idiot. My little disciple is even more of an idiot. My disciple is infatuated. This is as it should be." Then, this seemingly idiotic great grandmaster suddenly looked at the Qing Emperor and said, "When it comes to governing and fighting, I am not as good as you. There are not many in the world who are more powerful than you. Thus, I must respect you. I hope you don't mind my rudeness just now. Sir is too polite." The Emperor seemed to be intoxicated and bowed slightly. Then, the Emperor and Sigurd laughed loudly at the same time. Even the increasingly strong sea breeze could not stop the sound of the laughter from spreading. Sigurd laughter was naturally imbued with extremely pure Zhenqi, so it broke through the wind without any hindrance. However, the emperor's laughter was unhindered by the heroic spirit he had cultivated for a long time as the ruler of the world. The laughter abruptly stopped, and there was an awkward silence. It seemed that both sides did not know how to continue this absurd play. To kill or to be killed, this was a question and not a long play that needed to be talked about, told history, and told stories. Why had the Qing Emperor and Sige Jian clumsily performed this scene earlier? The Qing Emperor slowly put his hands behind his back and sighed. He no longer looked at the two great grandmasters on the stone steps. Calmly, he said, "I had followed Yunrui's intentions and followed her plan, intending to keep uncle here." Unexpectedly, Yunrui's plan was so crazy that she disregarded the safety of the country and tied Dongyi and northern Qi to her chariot. He turned his head without a trace of fear. Calmly, he looked at the shadow under Sige Jian's straw hat and said, "Great grandmasters have not appeared in the world for a long time. When they do, they will shake the world. Since the two of you have come here today, naturally, you must succeed. Although I am not afraid of death, I do not want to die. Thus, I have no choice but to delay. I truly do not know why you are also delaying with me for so long." Sige Jian was silent for a moment. His wrist hung down naturally. Appearing somewhat ill at ease, he smiled strangely and said, "Why am I so interested in this eunuch? Of the four strange creatures in the world, the three of us can all be considered divine friends. Only this eunuch likes to hide in the palace. It is because I understand Yi Luyun that I know his personality. If possible, he would act alone and not wait for us outsiders to interfere with the internal affairs of the Qin kingdom." Sige Jian calmed down and respectfully said to old eunuch Hong, "Even if eunuch was here, Yi Luyun would still act." He said one last sentence to explain the Qing emperor's question. "Yi Luyun has his reasons for not acting. Thus, I can only see why he hasn't acted immediately." Yi Luyun smiled gently and turned his body to face Sige Jian. "Foolish sword, do you still not feel it at this time?" Sige Jian's body was short, so the straw hat on his head appeared particularly large. The shadow completely covered his face. Even though the shadow was heavy, the people on the summit seemed to see the trace of a bitter smile at the corners of this great grandmaster's lips and a strange expression on his face. Everyone's hearts jumped. They wondered what kind of discovery would make Sige Jian, who had always viewed swords as an idiot and killed people like grass, quiet for so long. Sige Jian turned and directly faced the door of the old temple behind everyone. He raised his sword and bowed. After a moment of silence, he said, "I truly don't understand. Why have you come to join in on the lousy matters of the world?" The officials and priests who were seen by Sige Jian were terrified and quickly moved away, terrified of being touched by his gaze. Following Sige Jian's gaze, the people parted to make a path, revealing the black wooden door of the old temple at the very end. Outside the door was Wu Zhu, who was dressed entirely in black and seemed to have become one with the temple. Sige Jian's gaze pierced through the air like two swords and landed on Wu Zhu's clean face and the black cloth that seemed to never be tainted by dust. However, Wu Zhu was unmoved and did not have any reaction. Sige Jian sighed. The Qing emperor laughed again. This time, his laughter was more natural. "If you can come, why can't Lao Wu?" The emperor's smile faded and he looked coldly at Sige Jian. Yi Luyun smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said to Sige Jian, "When the mountain was surrounded, Fan Xian was on the mountain. Naturally, he also came." Sige Jian paused. This great grandmaster had never cared about the specific process of surrounding the mountain. After pausing for a moment, he suddenly let loose a torrent of abuse. He completely disregarded a great grandmaster's aura and dignity. A string of curses went on for several breaths, using all the obscenities he could think of. F*CK. Yun Jilan and Yen Xiaoyi, those two idiots. Why did they surround that pretty boy on the mountain? Siga Jian scolded as he panted for breath. Are they trying to kill me? His expression suddenly froze. He looked coldly at the Qing emperor and mockingly said, You brought Fan Xian up the mountain and found such a good helper. No wonder you're not afraid at all. Looks like I was wrong earlier. I am not as good as you in governing and military. I am even less capable of squeezing my own children and family. The Qing emperor smiled slightly and didn't say anything. It was clear that, regardless of whether it was Siga Jian or Yi Luyun, they both felt great shock and wariness toward Wu Zhu, who had suddenly appeared in the Qing temple at the summit of Dong Mountain. Although they were great grandmasters, past history and the miraculous happenings of this world had already proven many things. Otherwise, Siga Jian would not have sent 13th Wang to Fan Xian's side and thrown out his last disciple, whose personality was most similar to his but was particularly gentle. Was it not because of this blind man? Siga Jian suddenly looked at Wu Zhu and quietly said, Don't get involved in this matter. Go down the mountain. This emperor is not a good person. Us old fellows will give you a guarantee. Fan Xian will live a glorious life. Even if he doesn't stay in the Qing kingdom and goes to Dongyi, I will have him be the master of the city. Everyone present remained silent, but expressions of shock and terror began to appear in their eyes. They didn't know who the black-clothed man standing at the temple door was to be able to make two great grandmasters stop in the instant before they assassinated the emperor and to make Siga Jian, the always ruthless Siga Jian, make such a large promise. No one would disbelieve the words of a great grandmaster. Thus, everyone was even more curious about the black-clothed man who was closely related to Sir Fan Jr. The emperor's brows furrowed slightly. He found that Wu Zhu had his head lowered as if thinking about something. Wu Zhu thought for a moment and then slowly said, Apologies, Fan Xian asked me to protect the emperor's life. Like Yi Luyun, Siga Jian also opened his mouth wide and sank into an expression of shock that was even greater than when he saw Wu Zhu. A moment later, he shook his head and said, After 30 years, who would have thought you'd become so talkative? If I didn't know it was you, I would have thought you were being impersonated. Wu Zhu shook his head and couldn't be bothered to reply to such a senseless question. Siga Jian adjusted the straw hat on his head and said, Wu Zhu, we were friends back then. Unless I had no other choice, I didn't want to attack you. You have to know, in the 2 years after Nilon Mountain, I had tolerated Fan Xian for a long time. Everyone was shocked again and wondered what the friendship back then was. Wu Zhu was slightly startled. He thought for a moment and then quietly said, At that time, your snot was on the ground. It was so dirty. Siga Jian laughed loudly. I'm just as dirty now. I'm still that idiot with a runny nose when I was a teenager. How about it? Do you want to squat with me again? The corners of Wu Zhu's mouth twitched as if he wanted to smile. In the end, he didn't. He only shook his head. Siga Jian was silent for a long time. He then shook his head and put his sword back into the sheath by his side. Yi Luyun asked in surprise, What? Siga Jian pointed at old eunuch Hong and Wu Zhu. He then looked at Yi Luyun and said without good humor, 2 against 2. Only an idiot would attack. Yi Luyun said with a pained expression, But you, aren't you an idiot? I am an idiot, Siga Jian said seriously. But, I'm not crazy. Everyone present, including the Qing officials, priests, and a few eunuchs, was seeing these legendary figures for the first time. They were seeing the great grandmasters who were like gods in the hearts of humans. After the initial respect and fear, countless absurd feelings grew in their hearts as they watched the conversation. Were these old men who bickered like children the great grandmasters who had secretly influenced the situation under heaven for 20 years? The emperor watched this scene and waited for the curtain to fall on the drama. His heart was calm. If Sigurd-Yen and Yi Luyun truly retreated, this drama would become a farce. Sigurd-Yen was not truly an idiot. He knew what terrifying consequences it would bring if he allowed the Qing emperor to return to Jingdo alive. Sigurd-Yen yelled at the top of his voice, "In any case, I won't fight 2 against 2. If that bastard still doesn't come out, I will immediately go down the mountain." Hearing these words, the emperor's pupils constricted. His expression grew cold. Clouds rose and fell at the waist of the mountain. Heavenly swords pierced through the stone paths. Fallen leaves drifted with the wind. The wind passed and the light scattered. In a flash, a third person wearing a straw hat floated to the top of the mountain like a fallen leaf. He had finally come. Chapter 537. In this moment, Gauda thought he was flying. He flew past the layers of green forest on the mountainside of Dong Mountain, the faint mist in the forest, and the swiftly flying crossbow bolts. He flew higher and higher. The higher he flew, the further he could see. In that instant, Gauda saw the mountain gate at the foot of the mountain. He saw the long stone path, the blood stains on the green stone slabs, the flashing knife light in the forest, and the snake-like shadow of a sword beside the stone path. Then he fell heavily, breaking who knows how many twigs. He hit the wet ground of the forest with a thud, and almost fell off the steep mountain bank. Gauda gave a muffled grunt and used the Jinqi in his body to forcefully resist this attack. His entire body bounced up like a spring. His hands gripped the hilt of the long knife tightly. Raising his foot, he prepared to charge toward the stone path of death again. Then, with one movement, he felt all the bones in his body shatter at the same time. A muffled grunt came from his nose. The pain was unbearable. At the same time, 2 streams of blood seeped out of his nose. Gauda's legs weakened. He unconsciously turned his hand and stabbed the long knife into the ground beside him to support his body. Unexpectedly, the moment the tip of the knife touched the muddy ground, it shattered into countless pieces of metal in an instant. Amidst the crisp clanging sounds, Gauda fell wretchedly into the muddy ground in the forest. Beside him were pieces of the knife. In his hand, he held the pitiful remnants of the knife hilt. His eyes were filled with shock and terror. He had been sent flying by a person and a sword. As Fan Xian's personal guard, Gauda had the strength of an 8th-level martial artist. Back in the northern Qi Palace, he had forced back the enemy with one strike. How impressive was that? Even among the tiger guards of the palace, he was one of the few aces. Unexpectedly, he had been sent flying by a sword like he was swatting a mosquito. Gauda's gaze was complicated as he looked at the sword light on the distant stone path. His heart darkened. This time, Fan Xian had brought 7 of the tiger guards to Danzhou. Unexpectedly, they had been brought to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Then, they encountered the assassination attempt. As a tiger guard, their first duty was to protect the emperor's safety. Although Gauda didn't know that Sir Fan Jr. had already quietly slipped down the cliff, he still led the other 6 tiger guards and joined the group of palace guards. They began to carry out the most merciless killing on this precipitous stone path. 100 tiger guards guarded a mountain path. Logically speaking, there were no aces in the world who could break through and ascend the mountain. However, in this world, there were always a few existences that did not abide by logic. For example, the great Grand Master of the Qing Kingdom, Yi Luyun, who had turned into a flowing cloud and passed by, or the person holding a sword in his hand and killing gods on the stone path. His sword intent had already reached a peak. Gauda swallowed the sweet saliva in his mouth and forcefully calmed his breathing. As he listened to the sounds on the stone path grow softer and softer, he knew that his brothers had probably already died at the hands of that great grandmaster. The most basic requirement to be a tiger guard was loyalty to the emperor. Even though they knew that they were facing the strongest power in the world, they still resolutely stood on the stone path and stood in front of the emperor. Their blood splashed and their chests were cut open. They risked their lives and did not take a single step back. Therefore, the Gundam, at this moment, its first reaction was to charge forward again and block the path of that terrifying big shot, becoming another wandering soul under the other party's sword. Even if he was already heavily injured and his knife had been shattered into small pieces. However, the Gundam hesitated for a moment. On the long and bloody stone path, countless tiger guards tried to surround the figure with 7 people and use the methods they used to deal with 9th-level aces in their daily training to deal with that figure. However, all of their efforts were futile. The sword that seemed to have come from the netherworld and carried an indomitable aura was only gently waved and suffused with a heavy murderous aura as it sliced through people's knives, arms, and heads. The reason Gauda was still alive after flying over was because he had been influenced too much by Fan Xian these 2 years. Involuntarily, his murderous long knife carried some of the dark imprints of Fan Xian's little tricks. He was no longer blindly murderous and did not retreat a single step. Even when facing that figure, Gauda was still not his match. His meridians were about to be torn apart by the sword intent, but he still survived. Since he had survived, was he still going to send himself to death? No. A strange light flashed through Gauda's eyes. Sir Fan Jr. had said countless times that no matter what, he had to first keep his life before he had a chance to redeem it. The Great Dong Mountain was surrounded. If he charged over again and died on the stone path, it would be useless. He covered his mouth with his hand and allowed the blood to flow out between his fingers. He didn't make a single sound. He gazed at the bottom of the forest. It was clear that the rebel army's defensive circle had relaxed a little because of the arrival of 2 figures in succession. Gauda gritted his teeth. His eyes were filled with determination. He decided to find an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. From the moment he made this decision, he was no longer just a tiger guard of the royal family. He had not thought that this decision of his would bring so much shock to the world 2 years later. Drip, drip. The drop of blood slowly fell. It was a very small sound, but it was ear-piercing. It even made the people present feel that the sound of the dripping blood was even more cleansing than the sound of the bell in the old temple behind them. The drop of blood was dripping from the tip of a sword. This sword slowly rose and passed the last stone step, appearing in front of the eyes of the people on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword was very normal and didn't look strange. Even the hilt was casually tied with a layer of hemp rope. It looked a bit old and worn. However, it was precisely this ordinary sword that did not reflect much light on the surface of the sword that shone with a trace of power and coldness that made everyone feel fear. Especially when the blood on the sword slowly gathered at the tip of the sword and then slowly fell down. It was as if everyone who saw this sword felt as if the blood at the tip of their hearts was flowing out of their bodies through this process. Therefore, their faces turned pale. Then he saw the hand that held the sword, the person. The person wearing a straw hat and hemp clothing was not very tall. On the contrary, he appeared to be a bit short. He was the complete opposite of Yi Liuyun's confident and untainted image. Because this figure was short, his hemp clothing was in tatters, and his entire body was covered in dust and blood from the tears in his clothing. In his hand, he held a blood-stained, worn-out sword. He appeared incomparably wretched. However, no one laughed because of this wretched feeling. They knew that when this figure killed, he was ruthless. In terms of terror, he was even more terrifying than Yi Liyun. Old eunuch Hong looked calmly at the wretched swordsman ascending the steps and smiled slightly. He then slowly withdrew the tyrannical aura he had released. His entire body bent down and returned to the appearance of an old eunuch. The Qing emperor looked at the stone steps with a cold expression. He looked at Yi Luyun and the newcomer and took a gentle step forward. Calmly, he said, "Looks like Yunroe has invested a lot this time. However, uncle, are you going crazy with her? Betraying the country for the sake of the family is truly unexpected." Since that terrifying figure was standing with Yi Luyun, it meant that the most powerful old creatures had already joined hands and made a decision. They could not allow the most powerful emperor since the founding of the Qing kingdom to continue living. Yi Luyun smiled warmly. He didn't explain or defend himself. Ever since that terrifying figure holding a sword had come up the cliff, everyone had been silent, terrified of disturbing that person. However, the Qing emperor was not afraid at all. He smiled coldly as he stared at the hemp clothing full of holes. Mockingly, he said, "Sigurd, what are you doing on Dong Mountain instead of retiring in the grass hut? Look at your wretched appearance. You killed all of my tiger guards. Did you think you wouldn't have to pay a price? An idiot is an idiot. The Qing kingdom cured your insanity. It's fine if you don't think about repaying the favor, but you insist on using your sword to kill your way up the mountain and waste your Zhenqi. It looks like after all these years, your brain hasn't gotten any better." A short man with a broken sword and wretched clothes had killed his way up the endless stone steps and killed hundreds of tiger guards. In the entire world, there was only Sigurd, who only cared about what was in front and not behind, who pressed forward with an indomitable sword intent, and who single-handedly protected Dongyi and the small vassal states for 20 years. No one dared to be disrespectful to Sigurd. Only the Qing emperor dared to speak to him in such a tone. However, when these mocking words fell into the ears of those who paid attention, they heard a hint of being strong in appearance but weak in heart. No one dared to not reply to the Qing emperor's question. However, Sigurd couldn't even be bothered to glance at the Qing emperor. He only stared in a daze at old eunuch Hong beside the emperor. Gradually, the great grandmaster's gaze grew hot. It was as if they were going to pierce through the shadow under the straw hat and melt old eunuch Hong's old face. The short Sigurd opened his mouth. His voice was not like his body. It was as loud as a large bell. His voice could split pine, but it trembled with excitement. "It was you just now, wasn't it? What tyrannical Zhenqi?" Sigurd stared at old eunuch Hong in a daze. "I know Fan Xian also walks this path. So, you are his teacher. Speaking of which, the person who displayed power in the royal palace in Jingdo a dozen years ago was you. The rumors under heaven are indeed reasonable." The Qing emperor was ignored by this great grandmaster. Although the emperor did not get angry, his gaze gradually became icy. Looking at Sigurd, he said, "You have tried to assassinate me 3 times. You didn't even see my face before retreating miserably. Is there some unexpected joy this time?" It seemed that Sigurd had only just heard the Qing emperor's words. His gaze shifted slightly and looked at the Qing emperor's face. After a moment of silence, he suddenly shook his head. "You are far less handsome than your son. What is there to look at?" The emperor smiled slightly and said, "Naturally, I am talking about Enji. Have you seen him?" Sigurd tilted his head and said, "I have a female disciple called LVCC. Her senior sister disciple was clearly killed by Fan Xian, but after seeing Fan Xian from afar in Hangzhou, she forgot her grudge and became infatuated. Every day, she holds up some Banxian's book and reads it. Speaking of which, Fan Xian, that pretty boy, is not bad." The sea breeze blew gently through the summit of the mountain. The Qing emperor laughed loudly and said, "You Dongyi people are indeed all infatuated." Sigurd thought for a moment and then said seriously, "I am an idiot. My little disciple is even more of an idiot. My disciple is infatuated. This is as it should be. Then, this seemingly idiotic great-grandmaster suddenly gazed at the Qing emperor and said, I am not as good as you in governing and fighting wars. There are not many people more powerful than you in the world. Thus, I must respect you. I hope you don't mind my rudeness just now. Sir is too polite. The emperor seemed to be intoxicated and bowed slightly. Then, the emperor and Sigurd laughed loudly at the same time. Even the increasingly strong sea breeze could not stop the sound of the laughter from spreading. Sigurd's laughter was naturally imbued with extremely pure Jinqi, so it broke through the wind without any hindrance. However, the emperor's laughter was unhindered by the heroic spirit he had cultivated for a long time as the ruler of the world. The laughter suddenly stopped. An awkward silence fell. It was as if neither side knew how to continue this absurd play. To kill or to be killed, this was a question and not a long play that needed to be talked about, told history, and told stories. Why had the Qing emperor and Sigurd clumsily performed this scene earlier? The Qing emperor slowly put his hands behind his back and sighed. He no longer looked at the two great grandmasters on the stone steps. Calmly, he said, I had followed Yunrui's intentions and followed her plan, intending to keep uncle here. Unexpectedly, Yunrui's plan was so crazy that she disregarded the safety of the country and tied Dongyi and northern Qi to her chariot. He turned his head without a trace of fear. Calmly, he looked at the shadow under Sigurd's straw hat and said, Great grandmasters have not appeared in the world for a long time. When they do, they will shake the world. Since the two of you have come here today, naturally, you must succeed. Although I am not afraid of death, I do not want to die. Thus, I have no choice but to delay. I truly do not know why you are also delaying with me for so long. Sigurd was silent for a moment. His wrist dropped naturally. Appearing somewhat ill at ease, he smiled strangely and said, Why am I so interested in this eunuch? Of the 4 strange creatures in the world, the 3 of us can all be considered divine friends. Only this eunuch likes to hide in the palace. It is because I understand Yi Luyun that I know his personality. If possible, he would act alone and not wait for us outsiders to interfere with the internal affairs of the Qing kingdom. Sigurd calmed down and respectfully said to old eunuch Hong, even if eunuch was here, Yi Luyun would still act. He said one last sentence to explain the Qing emperor's question. Yi Luyun has his reasons for not acting. Thus, I can only see why he hasn't acted immediately. Yi Luyun smiled gently and turned his body to face Sigurd. Foolish sword, do you still not feel it at this time? Sigurd's body was short, so the straw hat on his head appeared particularly large. The shadow completely covered his face. Even though the shadow was heavy, the people on the summit seemed to see the trace of a bitter smile at the corners of this great grandmaster's lips and a strange expression on his face. Everyone's hearts jumped. They wondered what kind of discovery would make Sigurd, who had always viewed swords as an idiot and killed people like grass, quiet for so long. Sigurd turned and directly faced the door of the old temple behind everyone. He raised his sword and bowed. After a moment of silence, he said, I truly don't understand. Why have you come to join in on the lousy matters of the world? The officials and priests who were seen by Sigurd were terrified and quickly moved away, terrified of being touched by his gaze. Following Sigurd's gaze, the people parted to make a path, revealing the black wooden door of the old temple at the very end. Outside the door was Wu Zhu, who was dressed entirely in black and seemed to have become one with the temple. Sigurd's gaze pierced through the air like 2 swords and landed on Wu Zhu's clean face and the black cloth that seemed to never be tainted by dust. However, Wu Zhu was unmoved and did not have any reaction. Sigurd sighed. The Qing Emperor laughed again. This time, his laughter was more natural. If you can come, why can't Lao Wu? The emperor's smile faded and he looked coldly at Sigurd. Yi Luyun smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said to Sigurd, when the mountain was surrounded, Fan Xian was on the mountain. Naturally, he also came. Sigurd paused. This great grandmaster had never cared about the specific process of surrounding the mountain. After pausing for a moment, he suddenly let loose a torrent of abuse. He completely disregarded a great grandmaster's aura and dignity. A string of curses went on for several breaths, using all the obscenities he could think of. F***ck. Yun Jilan and Yen Xiaoyi, those two idiots. Why did they surround that pretty boy on the mountain? Sigurd scolded as he panted for breath. Are they trying to kill me? His expression suddenly froze. He looked coldly at the Qing Emperor and mockingly said, You brought Fan Xian up the mountain and found such a good helper. No wonder you're not afraid at all. Looks like I was wrong earlier. I am not as good as you in governing and military. I am even less capable of squeezing my own children and family. The Qing Emperor smiled slightly and didn't say anything. It was clear that, regardless of whether it was Sigurd or Yi Luyun, they both felt great shock and wariness toward Wu Zhu, who had suddenly appeared in the Qing temple at the summit of Dong Mountain. Although they were great grandmasters, past history and the miraculous happenings of this world had already proven many things. Otherwise, Sigurd would not have sent 13th Wang to Fan Xian's side and thrown out his last disciple, whose personality was most similar to his but was particularly gentle. Was it not because of this blind man? Sigurd suddenly looked at Wu Zhu and quietly said, Don't get involved in this matter. Go down the mountain. This emperor is not a good person. Us old fellows will give you a guarantee. Fan Xian will live a glorious life. Even if he doesn't stay in the Qing kingdom and goes to Dongyi, I will have him be the master of the city. Everyone present remained silent, but expressions of shock and terror began to appear in their eyes. They didn't know who the black-clothed man standing at the temple door was to be able to make two great grandmasters stop in the instant before they assassinated the emperor and to make Sigurd the always ruthless Sigurd make such a large promise. No one would disbelieve the words of a great grandmaster. Thus, everyone was even more curious about the black-clothed man who was closely related to Sir Fan Jr. The emperor's brows furrowed slightly. He found that Wu Zhu had his head lowered as if thinking about something. Wu Zhu thought for a moment and then slowly said, Apologies, Fan Xian asked me to protect the emperor's life. Like Yi Luyun, Sigurd also opened his mouth wide and sank into an expression of shock that was even greater than when he saw Wu Zhu. A moment later, he shook his head and said, After 30 years, who would have thought you'd become so talkative? If I didn't know it was you, I would have thought you were being impersonated. Wu Zhu shook his head and couldn't be bothered to reply to such a senseless question. Sigurd adjusted the straw hat on his head and said, Wu Zhu, we were friends back then. Unless I had no other choice, I didn't want to attack you. You have to know, in the 2 years after Nilon Mountain, I had tolerated Fan Xian for a long time. Everyone was shocked again and wondered what the friendship back then was. Wu Zhu was slightly startled. He thought for a moment and then quietly said, At that time, your snot was on the ground. It was so dirty. Sigurd laughed loudly. I'm just as dirty now. I'm still that idiot with a runny nose when I was a teenager. How about it? Do you want to squat with me again? The corners of Wu Zhu's mouth twitched as if he wanted to smile. In the end, he didn't. He only shook his head. Sigurd was silent for a long time. He then shook his head and put his sword back into the sheath by his side. Yi Luyun asked in surprise, What? Sigurd pointed at old eunuch Hong and Wu Zhu. He then looked at Yi Luyun and said without good humor, 2 against 2. Only an idiot would attack. Yi Luyun said with a pained expression, but are you not an idiot? I am an idiot, Sigurd said seriously. But, I am not crazy. Everyone present, including the Qing officials, priests, and a few eunuchs, was actually seeing these legendary figures for the first time. They were seeing the great grandmasters who were like gods in the hearts of humans. After the initial respect and fear, countless absurd feelings grew in their hearts as they watched the conversation. Were these old men who bickered like children the great grandmasters who had secretly influenced the situation under heaven for 20 years? The emperor watched this scene and waited for the curtain to fall on the drama. His heart was calm. If Sigurd and Yi Luyun truly retreated, this drama would become a farce. Sigurd was not truly an idiot. He knew what terrifying consequences it would bring if he allowed the Qing emperor to return to Jingdou alive. Sigurd yelled at the top of his voice, in any case, I won't fight 2 against 2. If that bastard still doesn't come out, I will immediately leave the mountain. Hearing these words, the emperor's pupils constricted slightly. His expression became cold. Clouds rose and fell at the waist of the mountain. Heavenly swords pierced through the stone paths. Fallen leaves drifted with the wind. The wind passed and the light scattered. In a flash, a third person wearing a straw hat floated to the top of the mountain like a fallen leaf. He had finally come. No one in this world could invite the 3 of them to appear in the same place at the same time. This was the self-awareness of being at the peak of the human world. Now, they had come to Dong Mountain for one person. The other party was the emperor of the Qing kingdom whose ambitions had never waned, the emperor of the most powerful nation in the world, the person with the most power in the world. Eunuch Hong, who never left the capital, stood beside the emperor. The 4 grandmasters were going to Dong Mountain. Assassinate the Qing emperor. The pinnacle of martial power and the pinnacle of power in the world were gathered here. Such a miraculous scene had never appeared in the history of this continent, and it might not appear again in the long years to come. Such a scene could only exist in people's fantasies, or in the stories of Northern Cheese storytellers. However, this seemingly impossible scene finally became reality on Dong Mountain at the end of summer. Furthermore, the target, the Qing emperor, the 4 great grandmasters, would never forget that there was a blind man standing in front of the door of that old little temple. A blind man with a black cloth tied over his eyes. Greetings, Your Majesty. The great grandmaster who came last was also wearing hemp clothing, but his feet were bare. The hemp pants fell to his ankles and did not cover his feet that were not stained by dust. The emperor bowed slightly. I haven't seen the imperial advisor in a year and a half. His spirit is getting better. He slowly took off the straw hat he wore on his head, revealing his bald head. The wrinkles on his forehead gave off a peaceful aura. In a quiet voice, he said, the emperor's spirit is also not bad. The emperor had already shaken off his earlier shock. Since Lao Wu had come, Sigurd had come, and he had also come. He laughed bitterly as if admiring his sister, who he had purposely left alive, for being able to make such a big move. I really don't know what power Yunroe has to be able to convince you all. In a moment, the bitterness in the Qing emperor's smile disappeared. Boldly, he said, you all are not mortals. I am the son of heaven, but I am also not a mortal. If you want to kill me, do you have the courage to bear the chaos after my death? These words were not false. Once the Qing emperor was assassinated and died, no matter how the eldest princess turned the situation around in Jingdou, the Qing kingdom would certainly be dealt a heavy blow. The emperor being assassinated was tantamount to ripping open a large wound in the hearts of the Qing people. The always stable Qing court had suffered such a heavy blow. If they wanted to maintain internal balance, they had to find an outlet to vent their anger externally. The Qing emperor's calmness came from his judgment of the situation. If he was assassinated on Dong Mountain and foreign powers joined in, regardless of whether the officials in court were loyal or not, under the powerful pressure of the death of the monarch, they would certainly be forced to mobilize troops. Given the Qing kingdom's powerful military power and the blood of the people nurtured over many years, once they raised the banner of vengeance for the emperor, how could northern Qi and Dongyi withstand it? Even if the other party had a great grandmaster, chaos was bound to rise. Once I die, millions of people will die. The emperor smiled disdainfully and looked at the three great grandmasters. You three have always liked to call yourselves the protectors of the people. Ku He, you protect northern Qi, and Sigurd Jian protects Dongyi. However, because of my death, your people will die, starve, be humiliated, lose their homes, and not be able to breathe for 100 years. Is this trade worth it? Ku He smiled slightly. If the emperor did not die, would he not send out troops? Would a world war not happen? The emperor slowly said, during these 20 years, there has not been a major war. You know best why. Ku He sighed and said, Your Majesty commands troops like a god. The Qing kingdom grows stronger each day. The reason why the emperor takes pity on the people and has not started a war is because there are still us old men alive in the world. Otherwise, even if you unified the world, it would be a world that could collapse at any moment because of us. Naturally, the emperor does not want this result. Correct, I am waiting for you to grow old, waiting for you to die. The emperor's eyelids drooped slightly. I am younger than you, I can wait, we can't wait anymore, Ku He sighed again. Otherwise, after we die, who will maintain the peace of the world? The Qing emperor's sword-like brows gradually furrowed. The small wrinkle between his brows held a glimmer of coldness and tyranny. Peace. The peace of the world is something only I can give. With just you three boorish men who do not understand the times and only know how to fight, do you think you can give the people of the world peace and prosperity? The Northern Qi imperial advisor, who was the last to ascend the mountain, smiled warmly and said to the Qing emperor in a quiet voice, 1,000 years later, no matter how the history books discuss the Dong Mountain incident today, it is not something we mortals can control. Each person is unable to take responsibility for the distant future. What we want to see is the present in this peaceful world. Ku He pressed his palms together slightly and said, At least before the three of us die, before we grow old, we have to take some responsibility for the world. So I must die. The Qing emperor smiled slightly and turned his head to look at Yi Luyun. Uncle, you are a person of the Qing kingdom. How carefree you are to ride a boat on the ocean. You want me to die. Is it for the peace of the world? Don't forget, the Qing kingdom has fought north and south and killed countless people. Your Yi family will take 30% of this. Without waiting for Yi Luyun to reply, the Qing emperor turned to Sigurd Jian and smiled coldly. What about you? A sword fanatic who kills people like grass has the world in his heart. Did you kill your entire family for the sake of Dongyi's peace? In the end, the Qing emperor gazed disdainfully at Ku He and said, Tianyi Dao has a great reputation for ascetic cultivation, but you cultivators do not produce and are all supported by the people. What do you count as? You are nothing more than a group of vermin. Fight against the moon. The Qing emperor shouted coldly. Don't think that just because you've shaved your head, you can wash away the blood on your hands. Uncle, you are only doing this for the continuation of your family. Of course, I had originally intended to kill you here. If you want to kill me, I have no complaints. Sigurd, you have protected Dongi for many years. I want to destroy Dongi. It is reasonable for you to assassinate me. Ku-he, you are the imperial advisor of Northern Qi. I want to swallow up Northern Qi. There is no need to say more about your wild actions. The three of you have a reason to kill me, and you also have the qualifications to kill me, but... He looked at the three great grandmasters with earth-shattering cultivation, and could not suppress his disdain. You all have your own little schemes in your hearts, so why bother to come up with an excuse to deceive the world? Wearing 3 straw hats and 3 hemp clothes, do you think you are common people? Wrong. You are monsters that should not exist in this world. The Qing Emperor stared coldly at the 3 great grandmasters. Are you worthy to plead for the lives of tens of thousands of people? The Qing Emperor gently waved his sleeve and laughed. His laughter was full of disdain and mockery. Perhaps it was mockery of the 3 great grandmasters who stood at the peak of the world, or perhaps it was mockery of his own fate of being defeated by the will of heaven. Never mind, the will of heaven has always been unfair. 3 ignorant people are going to ruin my great plan. For 20 years, I have often asked the heavens why they were not born 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago. Why did they have to give birth to you old monsters when I was alive? The most powerful middle-aged man in the world suddenly withdrew his smile and coldly said, "Now that everyone is here, what are we waiting for?" After Eunuch Hong withdrew his aura, the Qing Emperor stood by his side with his head held high. Surrounded by 3 great grandmasters, he laughed and talked without fear. What kind of confidence and spirit was this? If it had been any other powerful noble in the world placed in his current situation, no matter how clear-minded they were, they would have sunk into an unbearable emotion. Only the Qing Emperor continued to speak confidently and with assurance. There was not a glimmer of fear between his brows and in his eyes. There was only a glimmer of calmness after astonishment, as well as a faint glimmer of melancholy and helplessness after the calmness. He separately questioned the 3 great grandmasters coldly. His insufferably arrogant attitude did not weaken in the slightest because of the current dangerous situation. His long years of cultivation as the most powerful person in the world allowed him to naturally reveal the unparalleled dignity of an emperor even though he was surrounded by the peak of human power. Given the Qing Emperor's methods, boldness, and determination, there were already signs of unifying the world 20 years ago. He had the ability to complete this great undertaking and create another country after the Wei Kingdom. The Qing Emperor would also become the true ruler of the world. 20 years ago, the Qing Kingdom's pace of unifying the world was forced to slow. In the process of the Qing Kingdom replacing the Wei Kingdom and becoming the most powerful country in the land, the martial realms of the world suddenly took a leap. Beginning 30 years ago, a number of great grandmasters gradually appeared in the world. In the history of the human race, there had never been a monster who could single-handedly oppose the machinery of a country. Once such a terrifying great grandmaster appeared, even someone as powerful as the Qing Emperor would have no choice but to temporarily hold back the vanguard and seek a temporary balance in the land. What are you waiting for? The Qing Emperor once again repeated in a mocking tone. A proper great grandmaster is afraid of me. Zhang Mingyue, you've remained hidden. Are you worried that this Dong Mountain situation was set up by me and Yunrui together? With one sentence, he saw through the thoughts of others. The Qing Emperor had this ability, even if the other party was an unfathomable great grandmaster. He smiled slightly. The faint light reflected off the black clouds above his head. His entire person seemed to have become one with the summit of the mountain. In an even voice, he replied, "When all is said and done, Northern Qi and Dongi have been harmed badly by the Emperor and the eldest princess these years." Faced with such a good opportunity as Dong Mountain, the 3 great grandmasters would all wonder if the eldest princess' sudden loss of power and the crown prince's abrupt dethronement were part of a conspiracy by the Qing people. Thus, they had to see the true problems within the Qing kingdom. Everything at present, Yan Shaoi's rebel army changing commanders at the last minute, proved all of this. A strange sight appeared on the ocean. The layers of black clouds above the summit of Dong Mountain grew wider and wider. In the end, they connected to the horizon where the sea and the sky met. The entire sky was covered by dark clouds. The sky grew darker and darker. The churning and squeezing of the clouds seemed to be clearly visible. It was as if some unknown energy was accumulating between the shape-shifting and struggling clouds. The wind whistled. Thunder rumbled faintly among the clouds. It was as if the world was moaning in pain. Then, a drop of rain fell. Under the thickest layer of black clouds in the sky, the summit of Dong Mountain had already entered a strange realm. When the first drop of rain fell, it coincidentally landed on the golden dragon embroidered on the bright yellow dragon robe on the Qing Emperor's body. The rain fell on the coiled dragon's right eye. The bright yellow robe was soaked in water. It made the dragon's eye appear dim and sorrowful. Force. Unusually powerful four forces appeared at the same time on the summit of Dong Mountain shrouded in black clouds. They interfered with each other, nestled against each other, clashed, and gradually converged. They wanted to charge into the sky and compete with the heavenly might hidden in the thick clouds above the summit. Solid. The four forces contained tangible power. They merged perfectly together and advanced to a mysterious realm. When the first drop of rain fell, they controlled everything on the summit of Dong Mountain. All life began to lose control of their own hearts in this realm of reality and force. The Qing officials and priests of the temple did not fall to the ground because of the terrifying pressure. They were still standing. However, their entire bodies were frozen. There was not a sliver of possibility of moving. They were terrified, but they could not narrow their eyes. They lost control, but their urine could not wet their clothes. They wanted to scream, but they could not open their mouths. The long grass around the summit fell down like swords, piercing toward the center of the field. It was like they were worshipping the monarch of the mortal world. The copper bells on the eaves of the temple swayed gently. The metal inside also moved harmoniously with them and could not make any sound. The yellow soil on the ground slowly retreated toward the cracks in the stones at a speed visible to the naked eye. It shrank into a line, a quivering line, avoiding this boundless power. There was not a sliver of sound. All of it was sealed within the thick barrier formed by the terrifying power. The thunder of the killing clouds and the soft murmur of the raindrops moistening the earth all became the subtitles of a pantomime. One could see the form but not hear the sound. Surpassing the 9th level and breaking through the 9th level. Humans had always wondered what kind of situation would occur once such power was fully displayed. On Dong Mountain, the 5 most powerful people in the world acted at the same time. This power even faintly surpassed the limits of humans. It began to move infinitely closer to the illusory path of heaven. The wind rose without a sound. The heavy rain fell without the sound of a drip. The rain struck Master Ku He's old face. It was not turned into powder by the pure Zhenqi in his body. Instead, it gently and naturally slid down, wetting the front of his clothes, his hemp clothing, and his bare feet. The wild wind on the summit blew his clothes backward. He was like a mountain, standing quietly at the summit, welcoming the wind and rain. He did not purposely resist. He only gently and naturally mixed in with the wind and rain. He was borrowing the power of the mountain, wind, and rain to calm the tyrannical Zhenqi in front of him. Eunuch Hong held the Qing Emperor's hand with one hand. His entire body had straightened. The tyrannical Zhenqi in his body was unleashed without reservation. His hair and beard all stood up and pierced through the official hat he wore on his head. His clothes also danced against the wind. His entire body emanated a tyrannical aura that could scare away ghosts and gods. It was as if he wanted to completely crush the mountain, wind, and rain. A strange light suddenly flashed through Master Kuhi's eyes. It was a strange light that was completely at odds with Tianyi Dao's righteous and peaceful nature. His lips muttered something, but it was impossible to hear what he was saying. It made his body sway helplessly in the wind and rain, but there was not a trace of dejection. Of the 4 powers present, only Eunuch Hong used his full strength. His aura shot into the sky, shaking the rain around him and the Emperor into a pink mist. It spread around them and blurred the scene within. In the end, tyranny could not be maintained, particularly this kind of heaven-shaking tyranny. Eunuch Hong's eyes shone with a strange light. His entire person seemed to have become decades younger. Was he using up his life and Jinqi to delay these 3 great grandmasters for an instant and give Wu Zhu a chance to save the Emperor? Wu Zhu stood in the rain and allowed the rain to wet his black cloth. He did not move at all. Just because he did not move did not mean he would never move. Sigurd was like a streak of rain that had changed direction. Slicing through a black shadow, he stood between Wu Zhu and the Qing Emperor like a ghost. Sigurd also did not move. He only gathered his power. He lowered his head with the straw hat covering his face. The rain that filled the sky seemed to want to completely swallow this short man in hemp clothing. No matter how large the wind and rain was, it was unable to swallow the sword he held upside down in his hand. Wu Zhu glanced at the sword in Sigurd hand through the black cloth. The sword that still shone with a cold and bloody light in the wind and rain suddenly dimmed for a moment. Sigurd still did not move, but the powerful Jinqi in his body was forced out and seeped out through the hundreds of large and small holes in the hemp clothing on his body. These hundreds of holes were the price this great grandmaster had to pay for killing 100 tiger guards with one strike. Sigurd Jinqi seemed to be tangible as it shot out from the holes in his hemp clothing. Although it did not make a sound, one could feel it clearly from the rapidly swaying shape of the hemp clothing through the holes. After these pieces of Jinqi were forced out of his body, they did not break through the air. Instead, they danced around his body in a sharp arc. They danced around his body, causing the rainwater to dance. The rainwater became blades that danced noiselessly in the air. They were transparent and looked incomparably magical. Wu Zhu slowly lowered his head and flipped his hand around the metal drill at his waist. His brows furrowed slightly. In an instant, the blades of rainwater around Sigurd body danced even more violently. They severed all life around him and enveloped the entire summit of the mountain in an atmosphere of despair and ruthlessness. Sigurd had not drawn his sword because he was a foolish and stubborn sword. Yi Luyun also did not draw his sword because his sword had already pierced into the cliff at the foot of the mountain. Among the 5 great grandmaster-level peerless powerhouses present, only he looked a little lonely at the moment. He was a Qing person. He was the protector of the Yi family. He was called uncle by the Qing emperor. He wanted to kill the Qing emperor. His hands, which could cut through gold and jade and collapse clouds and capture the wind, were still firmly and gently placed in his sleeves. They still did not extend out. Master Ku he was the first to move. He moved 1 foot. He only took a step toward old Eunuch Hong's side and took a light step. Eunuch Hong felt like a mountain was pressing down on him. Raising his eyebrows, he bent the middle finger of his left hand slightly and struck out. Like a bolt of lightning, he used pure tyrannical power to break his opponent's harmonious stance. The mountain broke. The rain arrived. He pressed his palms together. The wind and rain in the sky changed direction in an instant and pounced toward Eunuch Hong's face, which had suddenly become dozens of years younger. When the rainwater touched Eunuch Hong's face, it did not leave any marks. However, there seemed to be a few more wrinkles on Eunuch Hong's smooth face. His entire person seemed to have aged a great deal. However, the rainwater immediately evaporated. Eunuch Hong dug out his index finger again and tapped it down in the air in front of him. Although it was silent, it caused the rainwater to move out of the way. It caused the stone tiles to split open, revealing the yellow soil below. Even the yellow soil could not withstand such a ruthless aura. Countless grains rolled and twisted, forcing out the moisture. He was like a fallen leaf, not touching the rain as he drifted back. The stone tiles he had stepped on earlier suddenly disappeared. Drying in the torrential rain, it revealed the cracked ground like yellow sand. He felt pity in his heart. He knew that this companion, who had hidden in the Qing palace for decades, had thoughts of leaving. Otherwise, he would not have chosen such a forceful method. What kind of tyrannical Jinqi was this? With such powerful Jinqi released, even the body of a great grandmaster would not be able to withstand it for a moment. He drifted forward again, still like a fallen leaf. Holding Eunuch Hong's left hand, it was like a fallen leaf finally being wet by the rain. It stuck firmly to the mottled wall of the temple, unable to break free. Eunuch Hong's eyebrows rose up. He's clothes began to flutter. The air between the two of them began to change endlessly, causing the wind and rain passing through them to suddenly calm. There was still not a single sound. Rainwater flowed down the straw hat and formed a curtain of water, covering Sigajian's face. He lowered his head and gently loosened his hand. He let go of the hilt of the sword. In the wind and rain, two fingers swiftly extended, each pointing toward the horizon. His fingers drew across. The wind and rain around him immediately became chaotic. Sword intent exploded. The long sword slowly drew down from his hand. It froze in midair and no longer fell. In an instant, it regained its luster. A bright light pierced the tip of the sword from the hilt. Murderous intent pointed toward the earth and the sky. It pressed forward with an unstoppable force. A bottomless black hole appeared out of nowhere in the ground. Wu Zhu lowered his head and tightened his grip on the metal drill. His thumb pressed against his index finger. His knuckles were slightly white. Yi Luyun knew he had to act. This last attack had to be completed by him. This was the most important part of the agreement. He slowly opened his eyes. His gaze was already calm. He extended a pair of pure white jade-like hands from his sleeves. Yi Luyun attacked with all his strength. The balance of power on the scene was immediately broken. Eunuch Hong's tyrannical aura was no longer able to withstand the combined attack of the three great grandmasters. A small crack immediately appeared in the mysterious realm. The small crack in the bubble was enough to destroy everything. The sound once again fell to the ground. A muffled sound rang out between Ku He and Eunuch Hong's body. Earlier, two streaks of Jinqi of completely different natures had collided, but the sound had been delayed until now. The muffled sound was like thunder and wind. The hemp clothing on Ku He's arms was completely shattered, revealing his old arms covered in blood. However, his gaze was still calm and peaceful. His hands gently brushed against Eunuch Hong's right hand. The fallen leaves were blown by the mountain wind. They drew strange but seemingly natural marks as they floated up. The imperial advisor's right palm gently caressed Eunuch Hong's chest. Eunuch Hong's face seemed to age even more. Then, Eunuch Hong's chest suddenly swelled up violently. It shook aside Imperial Advisor Ku He's palm that carried the power of heaven and earth. Ku He's face paled. He then gently pressed down a second palm. The Emperor sighed and released the hand that had been holding Eunuch Hong the entire time. The sound of his sigh rang out on the summit of the mountain that had been silent for a long time. It appeared desolate and calm. The waves only bloom for a moment, but they are no different than a millennial stone. Luyun is the same. The emperor is the same. Yi Luyun expressionlessly finished reciting this verse and came to stand in front of the Qing emperor. Ku He and eunuch Hong were together. Wu Zhu and Siga Jian were together. There was no one else in the world who had the right to stop him from completing the final attack to assassinate the emperor. A bolt of lightning in the sky finally reached the summit of the mountain. The sound of rain grew louder. The lightning flashed and disappeared. It only lit up for a moment. It was truly in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. In this instant, Siga Jian saw Wu Zhu loosen his grip on the metal rod. Siga Jian's mouth split into a grin. The two fingers on his hands bent. The rainwater at his fingertips dripped down. The long sword that had been floating in the air beside him flew out with a whoosh. It circled around his body in a semicircle and pierced straight toward the Qing emperor's back. In front of him was Yi Luyun. Behind him was Siga Jian's indomitable and concentrated Jinqi attack. Even a great grandmaster would not be able to deal with it. The matter had finally reached its end. The Qing emperor had already let go of eunuch Hong's hand. He did not want this old eunuch to be unable to enjoy himself in the battle between the great grandmasters because of him. His right hand trembled, but his expression was incomparably calm. He had already prepared himself to welcome death. People were always going to die. The rainwater entered the emperor's lips with a slightly bitter taste. The dragon in his robe was drenched in the rain and struggled in the clouds. It appeared particularly unwilling. After the lightning, thunder finally descended on the summit of the mountain. With a crack, it rumbled repeatedly. The Qing emperor stood proudly on the summit of the mountain, waiting for death. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.